It started with a phone call from my Uncle Ronnie. I hadn't heard from him in years, not since my dad's funeral. He lived way out in the Appalachian foothills, in a broken-down house surrounded by endless trees and crumbling barns. He was always a reclusive man, didn't keep a cell phone, didn't care for the internet. My mother used to say that if anyone could vanish from modern life, it was Ronnie. The call came just after midnight. His voice was shaking, hoarse like he hadn't spoken in days. "Caleb, I need help." That was it, just those 4 words, and then the line went dead. I stared at the phone, half asleep and trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But something in his voice, something dry and raw like panic from the deepest part of the soul, stayed with me. I knew something was wrong. By noon the next day, I was in my car, winding through narrow mountain roads, cell signal flickering on and off. Ronnie lived near a nowhere place called Trotter's Gap, not even a real town, more like a cluster of names on rusted mailboxes surrounded by overgrown dirt paths. It had been over 15 years since I'd been out there. The deeper I drove into the woods, the more the trees leaned in like they were closing around me. I arrived at his place just before dusk. His truck was parked at an odd angle in the yard, doors open, keys still in the ignition. A hunting rifle leaned against the porch railing, the barrel smudged with something dark and dry. I stood there for a long moment, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. "Ronnie?" I called. No answer. I stepped onto the porch. The front door was cracked open, and something about the air inside. It wasn't just the musty smell of old wood and dust. It was heavier, like the air itself was sick. I walked in carefully. The place was a mess. Rotten food in the kitchen. Muddy footprints everywhere. One of the living room walls had scratch marks gouged into the wood, like someone had tried to claw their way through it. There were symbols drawn in black marker all over the walls and ceiling. Runes or something like them, maybe Appalachian folk symbols, I wasn't sure. The house was empty. Ronnie was gone. I stayed the night, mostly because the sun had already dipped below the ridge and the forest outside had become this wall of blackness. I locked the doors, even wedged a chair under the knob in the bedroom. Every sound outside made my stomach tighten, branches snapping, something pacing the gravel drive. At around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch. Not the rustle of animals, not the scraping of a branch. These were slow, deliberate steps. 2 of them. Then nothing. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just stared at the bedroom door, feeling every part of my body tense like a coiled spring. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I found a piece of paper stuck between the front door and the frame. It had been written in what looked like charcoal, the handwriting frantic, uneven. "It comes at night. Don't follow the lights. Don't whistle back." I took it with me and stepped outside. There were fresh footprints in the mud, not mine, leading around the house and disappearing into the trees. I followed them. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe I still thought I could find him. Maybe I just needed to know what was happening. The tracks led through thick woods, deeper than I remembered. Every so often I saw more symbols carved into tree trunks or painted in dried blood on rocks. After a while, I started seeing strange little things hanging from the branches. Animal bones tied together with twine, feathers, human hair braided into little rings. About 2 miles in, I found a clearing. In the middle was an old well made of stone, the top covered by a rusted metal grate. Around it were piles of dead leaves and what looked like bones, not all of them animal. I was starting to feel lightheaded, like the forest was pressing in around me. That's when I saw a figure standing on the other side of the clearing. It was far away, just on the edge of the trees. A man, maybe. I couldn't make out his face, just the outline. Tall, hunched, wrapped in some kind of cloak or ragged cloth. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. I blinked, and he was gone. I turned around and started walking back toward the house, but it didn't feel right. The path twisted in a way I didn't recognize. The trees were different, too close together, and the canopy above seemed thicker, choking out the light. I walked for what felt like hours. The woods never ended. Eventually, I stumbled back onto the dirt road, but it wasn't near the house. It was farther out, maybe a few miles south. I got back just as the sun dipped below the horizon. That night, I found something else. A journal, hidden in the floorboards under the bed. Ronnie had written in it for months. The entries started normal, talking about trapping, old neighbors, weather, but they slowly descended into fear, ramblings about the watchers in the trees, something he called the hollow ones, and his belief that the woods themselves were alive. One passage stood out. They don't like the old paths. You step where they sleep, and they'll never let you leave. The lights are traps, the whistles are calls. If you hear your name in the trees, it's already too late. I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I saw lights in the woods. They weren't flashlights. They weren't car lights. They flickered like lanterns, but too fast, too erratic. I counted 3 at first, then 5, then more. They circled the house. I locked myself in the bathroom. I don't know why, just instinct. It had no windows. I turned off the light and sat in the dark, breathing through my mouth. That's when I heard the whistling. It came from every direction. A high, slow note like someone trying to mimic a bird but not quite getting it right. I covered my ears, squeezed my eyes shut. Then I heard my name. Caleb. It was whispered through the cracks in the walls, from under the floor, from the toilet bowl. Soft and scratchy, like a dying voice carried on static. I woke up on the floor. I don't remember falling asleep, but daylight had broken. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I grabbed my bag, the journal, the paper from the door. I ran to the truck and left that place without looking back. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, and even then I kept driving until I was in a different state. A week later, I tried to go back with the sheriff. We drove all the way up to Trotter's Gap, took the same dirt roads, but the house was gone. I mean gone. Not burned down, not collapsed, just vanished, like it had never been there. We searched for hours. The sheriff thought I was lying or hallucinating. I showed him the paper and the journal, but even those looked different. The ink faded, the pages warped like they'd been underwater for decades. I never heard from Ronnie again. No one did. Not even distant family. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and swear I hear the whistling. Once or twice, I've seen a light flicker outside the window, just beyond the tree line. Too fast to be a car, too still to be a firefly. I keep the journal locked in a safe. I never go near the woods. I never walk alone at night. And I never whistle. Story the end. It started with a missing person report. That's what drew my friend Caleb out to Glenmore Ridge in the first place. A rugged stretch of thick forest and sharp hills that people in our area mostly avoided unless they were hunters, surveyors, or people who didn't mind getting lost. Caleb was none of those things. He was a search and rescue volunteer and former paramedic with a hardwired sense of responsibility, especially when it came to rural disappearances. I wasn't supposed to be involved at all, but when he called me late that Thursday night saying he could use a second set of eyes and ears, I didn't even hesitate. I packed up my gear and met him at the ranger station just after midnight. The missing man was named Elliot Jensen, a 37-year-old wildlife photographer who had supposedly gone out to document a rare owl sighting. His last GPS ping was near the north slope of Bear Trap Hollow, an area neither of us had been to before, though locals said it was one of the roughest sections of the forest. It had earned the nickname because hunters claimed the terrain was so steep and uneven it felt like the woods were trying to trap you. People always said it half-jokingly, but there was something about the way the old ranger at the station warned us that made me uneasy. He was pale and quiet and kept glancing at the woods through the window as if something out there might be listening. We set out just after sunrise. The plan was to hike 5 miles up to where Elliot's signal had gone dark and then sweep outward in a spiral. It wasn't the most efficient method, but the terrain made drones useless and dogs had refused to go in. Literally refused. Snarled and cowered when handlers tried leading them toward the tree line. The fact that nobody wanted to say what they thought that meant only made it worse. The first 2 hours were manageable, though there was a suffocating quality to the trees. They were old and tall, and the canopy above was so dense it choked out most of the morning light. We followed a faint trail that twisted between exposed roots and ancient mossy rocks. The air was damp and cold, even though it was mid-May. Caleb tried to keep the mood light with dumb jokes and chatter, but even he fell quiet around hour 3. There was something unnatural about the silence. No birds, no bugs, not even the wind, just the sound of our boots crunching wet leaves and our own breath. We found Elliot's first marker flag around 11 a.m. It was a piece of orange tape tied to a thin pine branch, barely noticeable. Nearby, we found a crushed energy bar wrapper and a broken tripod leg. That told us we were close. Caleb radioed back to base and told them we'd found signs, but the static was so loud the dispatcher couldn't make out half of what he was saying. He tried 3 times before giving up. I caught the way he looked at his radio, almost like he expected it to melt in his hand. It was around noon when we found the clearing. It wasn't big, maybe 30 feet across, but every tree around it was dead. Not rotting, not struck by lightning, just dead. Black bark, dry as ash, no leaves, no sign of insects. The ground in the clearing was cracked and dry, the only place we'd seen without mud or moss. It made no sense. There was no reason this patch of forest should look like it had been scorched by some invisible fire. In the center of the clearing was Elliot's backpack. It was neatly zipped, sitting upright as if he'd just set it down. His water bottle was full. His journal lay on top, and Caleb flipped through a few pages. The last entry said, "Something following me. Don't hear it, but I know it's there. Trees are wrong here. Wind only moves one way. Night never comes. Need to leave." We both stood there for a long time, unsure what to do. There were no tracks leaving the clearing, no broken branches, no trail. Just dead silence and that strange black ring of trees. Caleb pulled out his compass and frowned. "What?" I asked. "It's spinning," he said, and held it out to show me. The needle trembled and turned slowly, never settling. We made the decision to leave, not just to backtrack and regroup, but to get out of the forest entirely. It was irrational, maybe even cowardly, but every nerve in my body told me we weren't supposed to be there. Caleb was more stubborn, but even he couldn't argue when the air turned cold and thick like smoke. It was hard to breathe, and I felt dizzy, like we'd walked into a pocket of air that didn't belong to this world. But when we turned to retrace our steps, the trail was gone. I don't mean overgrown or obscured, I mean gone. The landmarks we'd used were different. The trees didn't match. I remember a particular moss-covered log we'd stepped over maybe 20 minutes before. It wasn't there anymore. In its place was a boulder covered in strange gashes like claw marks, but too deep and wide to belong to any animal around here. We walked in circles for hours. I marked trees with chalk and then found the same marks minutes later from the wrong direction. The forest felt like it was folding around us, like it was moving while we weren't looking. We shouted, we banged metal against trees, and we even tried climbing to get a view. But the higher you went, the thicker the canopy grew, until the light above was completely blocked. By dusk, we were shaking from the cold and the fear. We made camp in a small ravine and tried to keep a fire going, but the wood wouldn't burn right. It hissed and smoked, even when dry. Caleb said he thought he saw something moving just beyond the firelight, a tall, thin shadow that stood still for too long and then vanished. I told him he was sleep-deprived, but I'd seen it too. But that night, we didn't sleep. Every few minutes, we heard something just beyond the edge of the camp. Soft footsteps, breathing, sticks snapping. The worst part wasn't that we were being watched. It was that whatever was watching us was getting closer, little by little, never rushing, never retreating. Around 3 a.m., I caught something in the firelight. Bare feet. Just the toes. They were filthy, almost blue, and they vanished the second I focused on them. I thought I was hallucinating until Caleb pointed to the exact same spot and said, "Did you see that?" We packed up and started moving as soon as it was light enough to see, but the light wasn't right. It was gray, flat, like it was passing through a filter. I looked up and saw that the trees above were still dark, despite the fact the sun should have been rising. That was the moment I realized something had changed. This wasn't the same forest we'd entered. The rules were different here. We stumbled onto a structure sometime mid-morning. It wasn't a house or a cabin, more like a shed made of stone and rusted sheet metal. There were no windows, only a warped door that hung crooked on its hinges. There were handprints on it, dozens of them, some small, like a child's, and others far too large to be human. They were smeared in something dark. I told Caleb not to touch it, but he was already moving toward the door like he was in a trance. I grabbed his arm, hard, and pulled him back. "What the hell are you doing?" I whispered. I heard someone," he said. I thought it was Elliot." But the forest was silent. We didn't go inside, we ran. Not in any particular direction, just away. Every time I looked back, I saw the shed in distance, closer than it should have been. The trees were narrowing, branches reached lower, almost brushing our shoulders, and I swear I saw eyes in the bark. Not reflections, eyes. Caleb collapsed just after noon. He was pale, shaking, mumbling something about the trees whispering to him. He kept repeating the same sentence, "They're wearing him. They took his shape." I tried to carry him, but I couldn't get us both through the underbrush. Eventually, I had to leave him propped up against a fallen tree while I went to look for a ridge or trail. I left a flare beside him, hoping I could find my way back. I told him to stay awake, to sing if he had to. I never found that tree again. Every time I turned around, the landscape had changed. The same rotting stump appeared no matter which direction I went. The shadows didn't move with the sun. They followed me. Sometimes I could hear Caleb's voice calling for help, but it was always just far enough away to be unreachable. Once I found his flare. It was burned out. The tree was gone. So was he. I blacked out sometime after dark. When I came to, I was lying in the road at the edge of the forest, covered in cuts and mud. A trucker spotted me and called 911. My boots were gone, my pack was gone, my map was shredded in my back pocket like something had clawed at it. I was 16 miles from the ranger station. Caleb was never found. They searched for 2 weeks and found nothing. No gear, no remains, not even a footprint. The area was officially closed off and labeled as unstable terrain, but I know that's not why they shut it down. Whatever's in those woods, whatever wears the shape of the people it takes, it doesn't want to be seen. It wants to lure, to confuse, to drag you deeper. And it almost did. Sometimes I still hear Caleb's voice at night, just barely over the wind. He's still calling for help. And I think someday soon, I'll follow it. Story the end. I was in my 3rd year of working with the Forestry Service when I got the assignment to check in on an old fire lookout tower that hadn't been used in decades. Most of them had been decommissioned after newer technology came in, but a few had been left standing in case of emergencies or remote camp use. This one, though, Station 17, was off the books. No one I worked with even remembered why it had been shut down. My supervisor said it had just fallen out of use and waved it off. It was late October, and the leaves were already crisp underfoot when I loaded up my truck. I was to drive as far as the dirt road would let me, hike the rest of the way in, inspect the tower, and report back. Easy enough. I was used to solo work. I preferred it. There was something about the forest, especially out here in the Appalachian foothills, that felt more like home than any town ever had. I drove 6 hours into the hills and another 2 on a narrowing dirt road. No cell reception, no radio, just me, the drone of my tires over gravel, and that hollow, watchful silence you only hear deep in the woods. I parked where the road turned overgrowth and started hiking with my pack and rifle. After 2 hours, the trail vanished. I wasn't surprised. Most maps I had were over 20 years old, but I pressed on using the compass and landmarks. The tower wasn't supposed to be more than 5 miles in. Still, it was another hour before I caught sight of it through the trees, a gray sliver jutting up into the canopy like a crooked finger. It looked worse for wear. The wooden supports had aged into splinters, and vines had climbed halfway up its legs. The trapdoor at the top hung open. A few ravens scattered when I got close, and one of them let out a call that sounded too much like a laugh. The wind shifted. I suddenly noticed the air had changed. It smelled wet and earthy, like something turned in the soil. I shook it off and climbed the stairs, careful with each step. They groaned under my weight, but held. At the top, I stepped inside and was surprised to find the interior nearly untouched. Dusty, but intact. Old maps, a desk, a cot, and a pair of binoculars by the window. Even a canteen on the shelf, though I didn't dare open it. I set my gear down and stepped back outside to take in the view. That's when I noticed something wrong. About 2 ridgelines away, a thin line of smoke curled up into the sky. It was too controlled to be wildfire, and there were no known campsites or cabins in that direction. No trails either. I made a mental note to check it out the next morning, then spent the rest of the evening cataloging the tower's condition. I logged the rotting steps, the moss on the roof, the condition of the walls, and the fact that, inexplicably, everything inside was preserved like someone had lived there last week. That night, I lay on the old cot, unable to sleep. The woods were too quiet. Not just quiet, dead. No insects, no owls, no rustling of deer. Just a heavy stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps below the tower. Slow, deliberate. I sat up, heart thumping, and reached for my rifle. The steps circled the tower once, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath. No movement, no voice, just silence. After 10 minutes, I worked up the courage to open the hatch and peek down. Nothing. But the ladder had fresh mud on 3 of the lower rungs, the kind of mud that glistens under moonlight. I shut the hatch, jammed a chair under it, and didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I hiked toward the smoke I'd seen. The forest got thicker, the light dimmer. I marked my trail, more out of habit than necessity. But the deeper I went, the more I realized the terrain wasn't matching my maps. Landmarks were off. Streams were in the wrong place. It felt like the forest had shifted. I found the source of the smoke just after noon. It was a clearing with a stone ring fire pit still smoldering. But there were no signs of a campsite. No tent, no food wrappers, no footprints. Nothing to suggest someone had actually been there, but someone had. A small figure was sitting at the edge of the clearing, a child, maybe 8 years old, pale, barefoot, wearing a nightgown. She stared straight at me, not blinking. "Hey," I said, stepping closer. "Are you lost?" She didn't respond. "Where are your parents? Are they nearby?" Still nothing. I reached out my hand. That's when she stood and turned around. Her back was covered in open welts like she'd been whipped. Deep, dark lines cut into her skin, but the wounds weren't fresh. They looked wrong. Not like injuries, like carvings. I took a step back. My boots snapped a twig, and in that instant her head twisted, fully twisted, back around to face me, while her body stayed facing away. I ran. I didn't even think. I ran until my lungs felt like they'd burst, until I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me. When I looked back, she was gone. I made it back to the tower by nightfall, locked the hatch again, and waited. This time I heard voices. Multiple. Whispers just under the edge of hearing. My name, spoken like a breath in the dark. A woman crying. A man repeating the same word over and over. I couldn't understand it. Something like hollow or follow. I didn't sleep. By morning, I wanted out. I packed fast, didn't even stop to eat. I retraced my steps, but after a few hours, I realized I wasn't getting closer to my truck. Everything looked the same. I circled back, tried a different direction. Still nothing. I camped that night without the tower, and it was worse. I heard movement all night, branches snapping, breathing near my tent, soft sobbing that seemed to drift in the air. I didn't open the flap. I just lay there, paralyzed. By the 3rd day, I was out of water and nearly out of food. I should have been able to hit the road by now, but I couldn't find it. The trees had grown denser. The light never seemed to change. It stayed a kind of gray twilight no matter the hour. I started to hear music. A faint lullaby, like something from an old music box. It always came from deeper in the woods, and I couldn't help myself. I followed it. I don't know how long I walked. I don't know if I ate. I only remember that I eventually came to a house. Not a cabin. A full house, 2 stories, with peeling white paint and boarded windows, completely out of place. No driveway, no power lines, just there like it had been dropped into the woods. The front door was slightly open. I don't know why I went in. Inside, it smelled like rot. The floors were covered in leaves and dirt, and the walls were scratched with words I couldn't read. Some kind of symbols or a language I didn't recognize. I walked from room to room, each one colder than the last, until I reached a staircase leading down. The music was louder below. I descended slowly, each step creaking. At the bottom was a basement filled with jars, hundreds of them. Inside each was something preserved in yellow fluid. Eyes. Teeth. Some were clearly animal. Some weren't. In the center of the room was a crib. Inside the crib was the girl. She stared up at me, mouth open, but no sound came out. Her eyes were black pits. Her hands were too long, too many fingers. I stumbled backward and knocked over one of the jars. It shattered, and a stench like burning hair filled the room. That's when I saw the others. They emerged from the walls. People, or what had once been people, twisted. Wrong. Their skin hung off them like soaked sheets, and their eyes were stitched shut. They crawled toward me, dragging themselves on the floor. I ran again. I didn't stop. I don't remember how I got out. I only remember the blinding daylight suddenly breaking through the trees as I burst out onto the dirt road and collapsed near my truck. A passing ranger found me the next day. Said I was dehydrated and delirious. They found no tower where I said it was, no house, no clearing, nothing. My map was gone. My compass too. I got transferred after that, desk work only. But sometimes when I'm alone and the wind is just right, I still hear that lullaby. I never went back. Story the end. It was the kind of place you wouldn't find unless you were looking for it, and even then, the woods seemed to try and push you away. A tangled mess of black pines and crooked oaks so deep in rural North Carolina that GPS gave up halfway in. Cell signal? Forget it. By the time you crossed the rusted gate where the gravel road turned to dirt, you were in a different world. That's where my Uncle Levi lived, off-grid, he'd always said proudly. I hadn't seen him in 7 years, not since I was 16. But when I got the call from the sheriff that he hadn't been seen in weeks and his mailbox was overflowing, something in me twisted. I owed him. He'd raised me a while after my mom passed, and even though we drifted after I left for college, he was the closest thing to family I had. I borrowed a beat-up Ford from a buddy in Asheville and headed out one Thursday morning. The air was heavy with summer moisture, and storm clouds hung low like they were waiting to follow me. The further I drove, the more uneasy I felt, though I couldn't say why. The towns got smaller, the roads narrower, and the woods thicker. By the time I reached the gate to Levi's property, the sunlight was dimming under the tree canopy, even though it was barely 4 p.m. His driveway was half a mile long, winding through thick forest, overgrown and clearly unused. Tree branches clawed at the truck as I crept forward, windows up. The deeper I went, the more the silence began to suffocate me. No birds, no wind, just the dull grind of tires on dirt. When the house came into view, I almost missed it. It was that swallowed by foliage. A squat, 2-story cabin, half log, half metal siding, with one of those big satellite dishes pointed uselessly at the sky. I parked and stepped out. The first thing that hit me was the smell, damp earth, mold, and something faintly sweet and rotten. The front door was closed, but the frame had splintered like someone had kicked it in. I pushed it open slowly. The interior was musty and dark, cluttered with tools, animal skulls, and old books. Levi had always been a strange one. Paranoid, maybe. He'd been obsessed with the land, claiming he'd found old symbols carved into trees, rock circles too perfect to be natural. He used to say there was something wrong with those woods, something ancient, something that watched. The power was out, naturally. I used my flashlight and called his name a few times, but there was no answer. I checked the fridge. It reeked of spoiled meat. Upstairs, the bed was unmade and dusty. It didn't look like he'd slept in it for a while. That's when I started to find the notes. They were scattered on the kitchen table, on the floor, taped to the fridge. Most were scribbled in barely legible handwriting, rambling and fragmented. They come at night. Tree line moves closer. Shadows inside the walls, not mine. They won't let me leave. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally cracked. Isolation could do that. But then I found the photos, printed on glossy paper, some of them grainy, dark. They showed the woods, night shots. In many of them, you could just barely make out something wrong. A figure behind a tree, a face too high off the ground, a shape that seemed to change in each photo. I should have left. Any rational person would have. But something about those woods had always fascinated me, and Levi's obsession was pulling at something in me. I decided I'd stay the night. Searched the surrounding forest in the morning. I barricaded the busted front door as best I could, dragged the couch in front of it. The place had a faint hum of dread I couldn't shake, like walking into a room where someone had just been murdered and their energy still lingered. I tried to sleep on the upstairs bed, but the sounds started around midnight. First, the creaking outside, like heavy branches swaying, but there was no wind. Then soft thumps, like footsteps. I turned off the flashlight and stayed still. Something was moving just beyond the cabin. I crept to the window and peeked through a slit in the curtain. At first, I saw nothing, just black trees and a sliver of moonlight. Then something moved. It stepped from behind a tree and stood there, too still. Tall, humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, head too narrow. I blinked and it was gone. I stayed up until dawn, heart racing, knife in hand. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I went outside with the flashlight and Levi's old hunting rifle. The ground near the cabin had strange indentations, not quite footprints, but deep impressions, wider than any boot, long and narrow. I followed them. They led deep into the woods. The deeper I went, the more distorted everything became. The trees grew too close together. Birds chirped off tempo like recordings played back wrong. I found the first circle maybe half a mile in, rocks arranged perfectly in a spiral, moss cleared from the center. I took a picture, but my phone glitched and shut down. No signal, no GPS. I pressed on. That's when I found the shed. It looked like it had been there a century, wood rotted, door hanging off. Inside were jars filled with cloudy liquid, each one holding what looked like small animal bones. Or not animals, some looked human. Tiny human. Fingertips. Teeth. I stumbled out, retching. That's when I heard my name. Ely, it was Levi's voice, weak, strained. I spun around. Nothing, just trees. Ely, again, closer. I followed it, against every instinct I had. The voice seemed to lead me in loops, always just ahead, always out of sight. At some point, I realized the sun had barely moved. Hours had passed, but the light was the same dull gray. I turned around and tried to retrace my steps, but the trail was gone. Trees had shifted, closed in. I tried marking trunks with a knife. Sap oozed black, not amber. I ran. In every direction, the forest was endless. I kept catching glimpses of movement, something just out of view. Whispering started around sundown, a dozen voices overlapping in a language I didn't know. Eventually, I stumbled into a clearing. At the center was another circle, this time of bones. Tall poles stood around it, decorated with strips of skin and hair. In the middle, something lay curled, bare, pale, thin. It lifted its head. Levi. He looked starved, eyes sunken deep in his skull. "Don't come closer," he croaked. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered, frozen. "They won't let me leave," he said. "Not anymore. You need to go." "What are they?" He shook his head. "They were here before us, before everything. You can't kill what isn't alive." Behind him, the shadows in the trees shifted. "They need a replacement," he said. Then he screamed. A horrible, strangled scream as something yanked him backward into the woods. I turned and ran. I didn't stop. I don't know how I found the cabin again, but I burst through the door, slammed it shut, and didn't sleep. The forest pressed in. I could feel it breathing. In the morning, I left everything behind. Levi's notes, the rifle, the truck. I ran until I found the road, flagged down a farmer, and told him I'd gotten lost hiking. I never went back. A year later, I got a certified letter with no return address. Inside was a single photo, me standing in the clearing, staring at something just outside the frame. I never remembered that moment. But in the corner of the photo, you can see part of a figure, tall, spindly, with a face that's not a face. Watching. Watching. Story the end. The gravel crunched under the tires of the old truck as Levi turned off the main road and onto the narrow, overgrown path leading into the woods. His cousin Nate, who sat slouched in the passenger seat, glanced nervously at the dense wall of pine and oak trees swallowing up the path ahead. The late afternoon sun filtered through the branches in shards, giving the impression that they were diving into a cave made of shadows and leaves. "You sure this is the right way?" Nate asked, sitting up a bit and peering through the windshield. Levi didn't answer immediately. He was focused on steering the truck along the uneven path, avoiding deep ruts filled with muddy water. "Yeah," he finally said. "I came out here last summer with Marty. He showed me where the cabin is." Nate frowned. "I thought Marty was living in town now." "He is," Levi said. "Said he got tired of the isolation. But he didn't sell the place. Just left it. Figured it'd be the perfect spot to clear our heads, get away from everything for the weekend." Nate was quiet for a few moments, chewing on his lip. "Does it have electricity?" "Nope. Wood stove, propane, and a generator if you need it. But it's peaceful. Real quiet." That quiet was what had Levi drawn to it. After months of working double shifts at the mill, getting chewed out by his boss, and dealing with a recent breakup, the idea of being miles from the nearest town felt like salvation. They reached the clearing just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The cabin, made of weathered logs and a rusted tin roof, stood crookedly like it had been built without a level. There was an old water pump out front and a pile of wood stacked beside the door. The forest loomed thick on all sides, so tight it looked like it could swallow the cabin whole if it wanted. Levi shut off the engine, and the silence hit them like a wall. "No birds," Nate muttered. "What? Just saying. It's weird. Usually you hear birds, squirrels, something. Levi climbed out and stretched. They're probably bedding down for the night. But even as he said it, he noticed the same thing. The woods were too quiet. Not just the absence of birds, but no insects, no breeze through the leaves, nothing. It was like stepping into a vacuum. They unloaded their gear quickly. Just backpacks, a cooler, exonoslide, and some sleeping bags. The inside of the cabin was musty, but in decent shape. A pair of dusty antlers hung over the fireplace. Levi lit a couple of lanterns and got the wood stove going. By the time darkness fell, they had settled into the stillness. They cooked hot dogs over the stove and passed a bottle of cheap whiskey between them, sitting on the front porch with their feet propped on the railing. "You remember when we got lost in those woods behind Aunt Diane's place?" Nate said, grinning. "Yeah," Levi chuckled. "We thought we were going to die out there. It was like 2 acres of forest." Nate nodded, smiling, but his expression grew serious. "This feels different, though. These woods, they're heavy, like they're watching." Levi didn't reply. He felt it too. That night, sleep came uneasily. Levi drifted in and out, his ears tuned to every groan of the cabin, every creak of the trees outside. Around 2 a.m., something woke him. A faint sound, not footsteps, but something scraping, like claws on wood. He sat up in his sleeping bag and looked toward the door. The lantern was out. The room was dark, save for the dying glow of the embers in the stove. "Did you hear that?" Nate whispered from across the room. Levi nodded, barely breathing. Another sound, this time a thump, like something hitting the porch. Levi stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. He moved to the window and peeked through a gap in the curtain. Nothing. Then from the tree line, movement. Not an animal. Not quite human either. It was tall. Too tall and thin, but the way it moved was all wrong. It didn't walk. It glided, limbs swinging loosely, unnaturally. It stepped just to the edge of the clearing and stopped, half hidden in the trees. Levi dropped the curtain and backed away. "What is it?" Nate asked. "I don't know, wife, but we're not going outside." They sat in silence for hours. The thing never came closer, but they could hear it moving, circling. The sound of dry leaves crunching, slow and deliberate. Every time Levi thought it might be gone, it started again, just out of sight. When the sky finally began to lighten, the noises stopped. Neither of them said much the next morning. They both knew what they saw, what they heard. They packed up quickly, intending to head back to town, but the truck wouldn't start. Levi turned the key over and over, but nothing happened. Just the click of a dead battery. The cables were fine. The fuel gauge read half a tank. Nate got out and opened the hood, checking connections. Levi joined him. "Everything looks fine," Nate said, frowning, "but the battery's completely drained." "How's that possible? It was working fine last night." "I don't know, man. I don't like this. I say we walk back. It's 10 miles through woods, no trail. Better than staying here another night." They loaded up what they could carry and locked the cabin behind them. Levi marked the trees as they walked, cutting notches with his knife. The forest felt different in the daylight. Not better, just more awake. There were still no birds, no sounds, just their breathing and the occasional crack of twigs beneath their boots. They walked for hours. The sun moved overhead and began to dip again. That's when they came across the first notch. Levi stopped dead. This is mine. I carved this." Nate stared at it. "We didn't turn around. We went straight." They looked behind them, then forward, another notch, then another. They were backtracking without turning. "No, that's not possible. I marked our trail," Levi said, voice rising. "It's like something turned the forest on us." They pushed forward again, this time ignoring the notches, trying to make distance, but no matter which way they turned, they ended up in the same place, the same rock outcrop, the same fallen tree. As night fell, they made the decision to return to the cabin. Only the cabin wasn't there anymore. The clearing was empty, just grass, trees, and the old water pump. The pump was still there, but the cabin was gone. Nate dropped his pack and stared, slack-jawed. "What the hell?" Levi stepped forward, circling where the cabin had stood. No foundation, no broken boards, no sign it had ever been there. "How the hell can a building just vanish?" "I don't know," Levi whispered. "I don't think we're supposed to be here." A cold wind swept through the trees then, and for the first time, the forest made a sound. A low, wet groan. Not quite human. Not quite animal. It was close. They didn't talk about it. They just ran. They didn't stop to mark trees, didn't care about direction. They just ran until their legs gave out and the darkness swallowed them. They huddled at the base of a large cedar, clutching their knives, listening. Something moved around them, slow and heavy. Branches cracked, but nothing ever showed its face. Nate didn't sleep that night. Levi might have drifted off for minutes at a time, but each time he jerked awake with the certainty that something had touched him. When dawn came again, the forest looked the same, but Levi's knife was gone, and Nate had blood on his palm with no idea how it got there. They moved again, hungry, thirsty, lost. They passed the same water pump 2 more times that day. On the 3rd day, Nate snapped. He started shouting, cursing at the trees, screaming when it came, not from the trees, from beneath them. The earth opened like a breath, a long, slow inhale, and Nate was pulled down into it. No struggle, no time to react. Just dirt giving way and then swallowing him whole. Levi lunged after him, clawing at the soil, screaming until his throat tore, but there was nothing there anymore. No hole, no sign of a body, just forest. He sat there until night. And then it came to him. The tall figure. He saw it again, standing in the tree line, watching. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Levi understood it wasn't going to kill him. It was going to keep him. It wanted him to wander, to starve, to lose everything, to become part of the forest. He doesn't remember when he stopped walking, but he's still there. If you ever find yourself near Calhoun County, Mississippi, and someone offers to show you the old hunting trails through the deep woods west of town, don't go. Even if you find your way in, you won't find your way out. Story the end. The cabin had belonged to my grandfather. It was a weather-worn structure tucked deep into the forest at the edge of Hollow Creek County. The kind of place you'd only stumble upon if you knew exactly where to look, or had nowhere else to go. I hadn't been there in nearly 15 years. Not since the summer I turned 13, when Grandpa died and my father refused to step foot on the property again. I never asked why. He wasn't the kind of man you asked questions to, and besides, I was too young then to understand that the silence meant something was wrong. After Dad passed away, the property was left to me. The official paperwork came with a polite note from the county clerk, who wrote in a tight script that the taxes had been prepaid for 2 decades, and the land was technically my responsibility now. I didn't give it much thought. It sat in the back of my mind like a strange relic from a different life until last fall, when I hit a wall in my own. I lost my job, my apartment, and a long-term relationship, all in the span of 3 months. When I found myself living out of my car, the cabin came back to me like a ghost. It took most of a day to get there. The last 10 miles were gravel roads that wound through thick woods, growing narrower and darker the deeper I drove. The trees closed in overhead like a tunnel. And my phone lost service a few miles before I reached the old trail that led to the clearing. I parked beside what used to be a fence, now just a broken line of rotted posts and bent wire, then hiked the last half mile in silence. The cabin looked almost exactly as I remembered. The boards were warped, the porch sagged, and one of the shutters hung loose, but the structure itself still stood. It hadn't been vandalized or looted. No signs of squatters. It was like time had simply forgotten it. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. There was a stillness in the air, thick and unmoving, like the woods were holding their breath. Inside, the air was stale but dry. Dust coated everything. The furniture was the same, rough-hewn chairs, a stone fireplace, the narrow cot by the window. There was even an old coffee tin on the shelf where Grandpa used to hide cash and bullets. I almost laughed when I found it still full. That night, I lit a fire, cracked a beer, and told myself it would be a good place to lay low for a while, maybe even long enough to reset my life. But by the 3rd night, I knew something was wrong. It started with the noises. At first, I thought it was animals. The forest around the cabin was wild, untouched, and it wouldn't have surprised me to hear raccoons or coyotes at night. But these sounds were different. They didn't come from the ground or the brush. They came from the trees. High up, like something was moving through the branches. I would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of creaking limbs, heavy steps, and an occasional low groan that made my skin crawl. Once or twice I thought I heard whispering, but every time I stepped outside with a flashlight, the woods fell silent. During the day, I tried to convince myself it was just in my head. Isolation does strange things to people, and I hadn't seen another human being in nearly a week. I spent the days chopping wood, cleaning out the overgrowth around the cabin, and trying to keep busy. But the unease stayed with me. The feeling that I was being watched followed. On the seventh day, I found the first symbol. It was carved into the bark of an old birch tree about 20 yards behind the cabin. A perfect circle with a slash through it, and 3 smaller marks beneath like claw scratches. The carving was deep and deliberate, too clean for an animal. I thought maybe it was a hunter's mark, but when I asked around the nearest town about 20 miles south, no one recognized it. In fact, when I mentioned where the cabin was, the gas station clerk went quiet and said, "You still up near Hollow Ridge?" I nodded. She didn't say anything else, just rang up my coffee and waved me out. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed by the fire, shotgun in my lap, ears straining for any sign of movement. The forest stayed quiet until just after 3 a.m., when something heavy thudded onto the porch. I froze. The boards creaked under its weight, and I heard something brush against the wall. Fingernails, maybe, or claws. When I finally got the courage to open the door, there was nothing there. No tracks in the dirt, no sign of anything at all. Just the lingering smell of something sour and metallic, like rusted blood. The next morning, I found more symbols, a dozen of them, carved into different trees in a wide circle around the clearing. Some were the same as before. Others were more complex, interlocking triangles, lines shaped like antlers or branches. I took pictures, but they looked wrong when I reviewed them later. Blurry. Warped, as if the shapes were still shifting. By the 10th day, the forest felt like it had changed. I don't mean seasonally. Something about the air, the light, the smell. Even the animals were gone. No birds, no squirrels, not even insects. I stopped hearing the wind in the trees. The silence became oppressive, like a weight on my chest. I tried to hike out that morning. I packed a bag, locked the cabin, and started walking the trail back to the car. But the trail was gone. I don't know how else to explain it. I followed the same route I had taken in, used the same landmarks, the broken fence, the split oak, but everything had shifted. The fence line was gone. The oak was whole. I kept walking, but every direction led me back to the clearing. I circled the woods for 6 hours and ended up standing in front of the cabin again, the firewood I had stacked still by the porch. That was the night I heard the knocking. It started just after midnight. Slow, rhythmic. 3 knocks on the front door, then nothing. 10 minutes later, 3 more. I stood there, frozen, shotgun ready, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. The knocking continued every 10 minutes for nearly an hour. Then it stopped. I stayed up until dawn, waiting. When I finally opened the door, there was a gift on the porch. A bundle of feathers, bones, and twine tied together with what looked like human hair. I kicked it into the fire and stayed inside for the rest of the day. But that night, I heard the knocking again. It didn't stop at 3. It grew louder, more insistent. From the back door, then the windows. Scraping, pounding, something walking the perimeter of the cabin. I fired a shot through the window, but the moment the sound echoed through the trees, everything went quiet again. I thought maybe I had scared it off. I was wrong. Around 4 a.m., I heard my grandfather's voice. It was faint, just outside the back door. "David," it said. "It's cold out here. Let me in." I felt every hair on my body stand up. My grandfather had been dead for 15 years. I didn't move. The voice repeated, softer this time, more pleading. "It's me, boy. Open the door. You know it's me." When I didn't respond, the voice changed. It grew deeper, more guttural, as if something was straining to mimic speech. "Door." The doorknob rattled. Then came a wet, dragging sound, like something sliding along the wall. I stayed in the center of the cabin, flashlight off, shotgun ready. The sounds eventually faded around dawn. I tried to leave again the next day. I packed lighter this time, carried only what I could run with. But the woods wouldn't let me go. The trees were wrong, angled in strange ways, paths leading to nowhere, the horizon twisted and unreachable. I hiked for hours only to find myself back at the cabin again and again. That night, I boarded up the windows and locked every door. I didn't sleep. At some point after midnight, the knocking returned. But this time it came from inside the walls. It started in the bedroom, a soft tapping, like someone lightly knocking from the other side of the wooden boards. Then it moved to the living room. The sound of nails dragging across the inside of the walls, something moving in the crawl space, too large for any animal. I backed into the corner and waited with the shotgun, heart pounding. Then I heard whispering from the fireplace. I didn't understand the words. They weren't in any language I knew, but they echoed through the cabin like wind through dead leaves. I aimed the shotgun at the hearth, but before I could move, something laughed, low and deep, and not human. I screamed and fired both shells. The sound stopped. The blast knocked soot and ash into the air. The fireplace was empty. When morning came, I decided I couldn't survive another night. I gathered the last of my supplies and set the cabin on fire. It took quickly. Dry wood, old drapes, oil from the lanterns. Within minutes, the flames roared through the structure. I watched from the edge of the clearing, hoping, praying, that whatever was in that place would burn with it. But even as the fire raged, I saw something standing in the smoke. A tall figure, too thin, arms too long, with a face that flickered and changed. Sometimes mine, sometimes my grandfather's late, sometimes strangers I didn't recognize. It didn't move, it just watched. I ran. I don't know how long I was out there. 2 days, maybe 3. I stopped keeping track. I walked until my feet bled and my skin cracked from the cold. I passed the same trees more times than I can count. I was starving, dehydrated, hallucinating. At least I told myself I was hallucinating. Because if I wasn't, then the things I saw in those woods were real. Eventually, I stumbled onto a fire road and was picked up by a ranger. They said I was lucky to be alive. I was treated for exposure and kept under observation for 3 days. I told them I got lost, that the cabin burned down in an accident. They didn't ask for more, but something followed me. I hear it in my apartment sometimes, in the vents, in the walls. Soft knocks in the middle of the night. Sometimes a whisper calling my name in my grandfather's voice. I don't go near mirrors anymore. I don't walk near wooded areas. And every night I sleep with the lights on and a loaded gun by my side. But I know none of that will help. The forest let me leave. It won't let me forget. Story the end. The old gravel road that led into Black Hollow had been untouched for decades. It wound through towering pine and oak trees, their branches tangled and thick enough to blot out the sky in places. Locals said the forest swallowed light whole. No one ventured far past the last weathered road sign, faded to nearly unreadable, warning private property, no trespassing. But this summer I found myself driving down that road, curiosity dragging me deeper into the woods than I'd ever dared before. It all started with an old journal I discovered in my grandfather's attic, buried beneath a pile of moth-eaten blankets and rusted tin cans. The journal belonged to a man named Emmett Holloway, my grandfather's great-uncle, I later learned. The entries spanned decades, mostly mundane notes about farming and weather, but toward the end, the writing became frantic, almost desperate. He wrote about strange sounds in the night, shadows that didn't belong to any tree or animal, and a chilling presence that seemed to stalk the forest. At first, I thought it was just an old man's superstition, the kind of folk tales that grow from loneliness and the eerie silence of rural life. But then I read the last entry, written on a cracked, yellowed page. They're watching, waiting in the trees. I hear them whispering, calling my name. The woods are alive. If I don't leave, I won't leave at all. That entry was dated June 19th, 1954. That summer, I decided to see Black Hollow for myself. I wanted to know if there was any truth to the stories, if the forest really held something unnatural. I packed a small bag with essentials, a tent, water, a flashlight, and my grandfather's old hunting knife, and set off early one morning. The drive to the edge of the hollow was uneventful, the countryside rolling gently beneath a bright sun. But as I reached the gravel road and turned onto it, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew cooler, the sunlight dimmer beneath the dense canopy. My radio lost signal, and even my phone showed no bars. After about 15 minutes, the road disappeared entirely, replaced by a narrow path barely wide enough for my car. The branches scraped the roof and sides, leaves tapping rhythmically against the windows. I parked near an old stone wall, half collapsed and covered in moss. Beyond it, the forest swallowed everything. I stepped out, pulling my jacket tight against a sudden chill. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the distant call of a crow. I checked my gear and began walking. The first few hours passed without incident. I followed what looked like an overgrown hunting trail, careful to mark my path with strips of cloth tied around tree branches. The forest was dense and dark, but alive with sounds: rustling leaves, distant animal calls, the buzz of insects. Still, something felt off. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I reached a small clearing. A shallow, circular depression in the earth sat at its center, surrounded by stones arranged in a crude pattern. The ground inside was oddly bare, as if nothing could grow there. I crouched down and noticed faint scratches along the stones, almost like claw marks, but jagged and uneven. My skin prickled. I took a photo and made a note in my journal before setting up camp nearby. That night, as I lay in my tent listening to the forest, I thought I heard voices, low whispers carried on the wind. I convinced myself it was just my imagination until the whispering grew clearer, more urgent. Eli. My name carried softly through the trees. I sat up, heart pounding. The flashlight illuminated nothing but darkness beyond the tent flap. The whispers stopped. Morning came reluctantly. I packed quickly and followed my markers back toward the car. But as I walked, I realized the path was changing. Branches seemed to have moved overnight, and the markers I tied were missing or ripped down. Panic crept in. I quickened my pace, but soon found myself hopelessly lost. The forest was a maze of shadows and shifting shapes, trees growing closer together, the air thick and heavy. Then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, tall and thin, impossibly still, its limbs long and spindly. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I felt its eyes burning into me. I froze. It stepped forward, and the ground seemed to ripple beneath its feet. The whispering returned, louder now, an unintelligible chorus. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes and skin, roots tripped me, and the forest seemed to close in with every desperate step. I stumbled into another clearing, the one from the night before, and there the figure waited. Behind it, dozens of others emerged, shadows twisting and stretching in unnatural ways. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight. I scrambled backward, heart hammering. They began to move toward me, slow and deliberate. Then a voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Stop!" The shadows hesitated. From the trees emerged a man, tall and weathered, carrying a lantern. His face was stern but kind. "You shouldn't be here," he said, motioning for me to follow. I didn't hesitate. He led me through a hidden path, winding and confusing, until we reached an old cabin nestled deep in the woods. Inside, he introduced himself as Thomas, a descendant of the Holloway family, sworn to guard the forest's secrets. He explained that Black Hollow was a place of ancient power, home to entities older than humanity, beings that fed on fear and life itself. The circles of stones were seals, keeping the creatures bound. Emmett Holloway had been one of the last to try breaking those seals, hoping to control the forest's power, but it had consumed him. Thomas warned me never to return. The next morning, he guided me back to my car, disappearing silently as the sun rose. I left Black Hollow behind, but the memory never faded. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispering on the wind calling my name. Story, the end. It started with a simple plan. I wanted to get away from the city for a while. No screens, no noise, just me and the woods. My friend Tyler had mentioned this old family cabin his grandfather owned out near the Pisgah National Forest, about 3 hours from Asheville. The kind of place where cell service was spotty at best, and you could hear the wind in the trees at night like it was whispering secrets. It sounded perfect. We packed up my beat-up Jeep on a Friday afternoon, loaded with tents, food, and enough gear to last a weekend. Tyler had been out there before, but never for more than a day or two. The plan was simple. Hike in, camp near the cabin, and spend some time fishing and hiking. Maybe unwind, get a little lost in the quiet. The drive was long and winding. The closer we got, the narrower and bumpier the dirt roads became, twisting through thick forest. At some points, the trees bent so close overhead that they blocked out the sun, casting long shadows even in the middle of the day. The GPS lost signal early on, but Tyler seemed confident in his sense of direction. After what felt like an eternity of dusty turns, we finally pulled up to the clearing where the cabin sat. It was small, more like a shack, with faded green paint peeling off the sides and a rusty metal roof. A stone chimney curled up along one side, stained black from years of fires. The porch sagged under its own weight, and an old wooden rocking chair sat crookedly by the door. The whole place had an air of abandonment, like it hadn't been touched in years. Tyler said his grandfather hadn't been here in over a decade. We dropped our bags inside and found the cabin surprisingly intact. A wood stove sat in the corner, a couple of rickety chairs were scattered around, and the windows were all covered in grime. There was a single bedroom with a musty mattress, and a tiny kitchen with a cracked sink and a few rusty pots hanging on the wall. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. No hum of cars, no buzz of electricity, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl somewhere deep in the woods. We sat on the porch drinking cheap beer, watching the stars burn bright overhead, feeling miles away from anything. Around midnight, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dry leaves skittering across the porch. That's when I first heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first, I thought it was just the wind hitting some loose branches, but then Tyler shushed me and pointed. Through the window, beyond the ring of firelight, there was a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. Tall, thin, unmoving. The dark outline was barely visible against the trees, but I could see its head slowly turn to look straight at us. Tyler swore it was just a deer or some animal, but the way it stood there, so still and deliberate, didn't feel right. I tried to laugh it off, but my heart was pounding in my chest. "Maybe it's a hunter?" I whispered. "No one should be out here this late," Tyler said, his voice tense, "especially not without a flashlight." We sat frozen, eyes glued to the dark spot where the figure had been. After a few minutes, it was gone. The tapping stopped. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the feeling lingered. When morning came, we decided to check around the perimeter of the clearing. There were no footprints, no signs of any visitor, just the usual animal tracks from raccoons and deer. We shrugged it off and spent the day hiking down to a nearby creek. The woods were dense, alive with birdsong and the rustle of squirrels. We joked about the figure from the night before, calling it the Shadow Man, but neither of us could shake the chill it left behind. That evening, while Tyler was setting up the campfire, I noticed something strange. Scratches on the wooden porch steps, deep and fresh, like long, sharp claws had torn into the wood. They were irregular, jagged, and stretched across the entire width of the step. "Look at this," I called out, pointing. Tyler frowned, crouching down to inspect the marks. "Could be from a bear," he said, "but bears don't usually do this near cabins." I remembered the figure from the night before, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. Later, as darkness swallowed the woods, the wind began to moan again. We huddled close by the fire, throwing logs on to keep the flames roaring. Then the tapping started once more. Slow, deliberate, moving from one side of the clearing to the other. We froze, staring into the blackness beyond the firelight. Then faint footsteps, heavy, thudding on the soft earth. Tyler grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the tree line, but there was nothing there. The tapping stopped abruptly. For a moment, the forest was silent. Then came the whisper. It was barely audible, like the wind carrying voices just beyond comprehension. Words, maybe, or something else. The hairs on my neck stood up. "Did you hear that?" I asked, voice shaking. Tyler nodded. "We should get inside." We scrambled into the cabin and bolted the door. The windows rattled in their frames as the wind swirled outside. The whispering continued, now more insistent, curling around the cabin like smoke. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the front door, like something heavy slammed against it. Then, again, and again. I backed away from the door, heart hammering, while Tyler grabbed a rusty hunting knife from the kitchen counter. "Whatever it is, it wants in," he muttered. The banging stopped as suddenly as it had started. Outside, silence returned. We stayed awake the whole night, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Morning light brought no comfort. The porch steps were shredded even worse. Deep gouges torn into the wood, splinters scattered everywhere. We debated leaving, but the nearest town was miles away, and the roads were barely passable after last night's rain. We decided to hike down to the main road to find help. Packing our gear, we stepped outside. The forest felt different in daylight, oppressive and watchful. The trees seemed too tall, their branches like grasping fingers. As we walked toward the trail, I noticed something else. Piles of small, twisted branches arranged in strange patterns near the trees, like crude symbols or totems. Tyler stopped, staring at one of them. "This isn't natural." I agreed. We took pictures, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every rustle, every bird call sounded like a warning. About a mile down the path, the forest opened up to an old clearing. In the center was a circle of stones half buried in moss and dirt. The stones were jagged and dark, arranged in a way that made my skin crawl. Tyler whispered, "This must be some kind of old ritual site." Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the clearing, and I heard that whispering again, clearer now. Words in a language I didn't understand carried on the breeze. I turned to say something to Tyler, but he was already gone, vanished into the trees like a shadow swallowed by the forest. "Tyler!" I shouted, panic rising. No answer. I ran back toward the trail, but the trees seemed to shift around me. The path I'd been following disappeared beneath a tangle of roots and thick underbrush. I was lost. The whispering grew louder, surrounding me from all sides. I stumbled through the brush, heart racing, trying to find the trail, but every direction looked the same. Twisted trunks and endless darkness. Night fell fast, and the cold crept in. I tried to start a fire, but my hands were shaking too badly. The whispers turned into murmurs, then voices, soft and sinister, chanting just beyond sight. I curled up beneath a fallen tree, trying to stay quiet. Hours later, I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching leaves nearby. I held my breath, clutching a broken branch for defense. A figure emerged, not human, but something thin and elongated, face pale and distorted, eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It didn't speak, just stared with an unsettling calm. I froze, unable to move or scream. The figure reached out a long, skeletal hand toward me. Suddenly, a shout pierced the air. "Hey! Over here!" Tyler burst through the underbrush, holding a flashlight and a hunting rifle. The figure vanished into the shadows as Tyler grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently. We ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at our faces, the whispering fading behind us. After what felt like hours, we stumbled onto a gravel road. A car passed by and we flagged it down. The driver was a middle-aged woman who listened to our story with wide eyes and an uneasy silence. She told us about the Woodspeople, strange legends of creatures that lived deep in the Pisgah forest, spirits that lured wanderers to their doom with whispers and illusions. We never went back. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can hear that tapping on the cabin porch, feel the cold breath of those unseen watchers, and see the twisted stones waiting silently in the clearing. Some things don't want to be found. Story the end. It started as a weekend getaway, a simple trip into the deep woods to escape the noise of city life. Mark and his friends, Jake, Lisa, and Rachel, had been planning it for months. They wanted to hike, camp, and maybe fish in the river nearby. None of them were experienced outdoorsmen, but the idea of disconnecting from their screens and responsibilities was too appealing to pass up. They rented an old cabin deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town. The GPS barely worked once they were out of range, and cell service was non-existent. When they arrived, the sun was already dipping low behind the dense canopy. The air smelled damp and mossy, the kind of scent only untouched woods carry. The cabin looked run down but solid enough. Its wooden walls were weather-beaten, the windows covered in a thin layer of grime. A rusty metal stove sat in the corner, and a pile of chopped firewood rested beside the back door. Mark felt a shiver as he stepped inside, but he shrugged it off, probably just the chill in the air. The first night was uneventful. They sat around a campfire outside, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The forest seemed to hum with life. Distant owl calls, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. It was peaceful in a primal way. But on the second night, things changed. Rachel woke them up around 2 a.m., whispering that she thought she heard something outside. Mark grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing nothing but the swaying trees. The forest was silent, unnervingly so. No animals, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. "I don't see anything," Mark said, trying to sound confident. "Maybe it was a deer or something," Jake said, rolling over to try to sleep again. Lisa didn't look convinced. "Still feels weird out here." The next day, they decided to explore the woods more thoroughly. They packed water bottles and a first aid kit, trying to stay on a mapped trail. But the deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to close in. Branches tangled overhead, blocking out sunlight. The trail grew faint and littered with broken twigs, as if something or someone had been moving around. Jake joked about being hunted by wild animals, but Mark noticed the joke didn't land the same way it usually would. The group's mood was tense. At one point, Lisa stopped abruptly, pointing to something on the ground. "Look at this," she said. They all gathered around a small clearing. There were strange markings scratched into the bark of several trees, deep gouges that looked fresh. The shapes were irregular, like a crude pattern or symbol, but none of them recognized it. Rachel shivered. "That's unsettling." They hurried back to the cabin, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. That night, the noises started. First, soft thuds against the cabin walls like heavy footsteps, then scratching at the door, sharp and persistent. Mark grabbed a baseball bat and stood by the window, shining his flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. But then came the whispering. Faint voices carried on the wind, indecipherable but distinctly human. Lisa clutched her blanket, eyes wide with fear. Maybe we should leave," she whispered. Mark tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't shake the unease creeping over him. Around midnight, the power flickered. There was no electricity, but the small lantern in the cabin dimmed and flared. The temperature dropped sharply, breath visible in the cold air. Then the door handle rattled violently, like someone trying to break in. They huddled together, backs against the wall. Suddenly, a loud banging shattered the silence, and the door swung open on its own, creaking in the wind. Outside, the woods were pitch black, but just beyond the threshold, Mark saw a figure, tall, gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly red. He blinked, and the figure vanished. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees. Rachel was suddenly gone from their side. They searched desperately, calling her name, but only the forest responded. Hours later, just as dawn broke, they found her boots near the riverbank, but no sign of Rachel herself. Panic set in. They wanted to leave immediately, but their car wouldn't start. The battery was dead. Phones had no signal. They were trapped. Mark decided to check the cabin's shed for supplies. As he opened the door, he found it filled with strange items. Old bones, animal skulls, dried herbs, and more of those symbols carved into wood pieces. He stumbled back inside, heart pounding. Lisa and Jake stared at him, eyes wide. "Whatever's here," Mark said, voice shaking. "This isn't just nature, it's something else." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. At night, the forest seemed alive with shadows moving just beyond the firelight. On the third night, Mark awoke to the sound of soft chanting. He slipped out of the cabin, following the noise to a clearing lit by a flickering fire. Around it stood figures cloaked in tattered robes, faces hidden under hoods. Mark froze as the chanting grew louder, words in an ancient tongue that made his skin crawl. Suddenly, the group stopped and turned toward him. Without thinking, Mark ran back to the cabin. Jake and Lisa were waiting anxiously. "We have to get out," Mark gasped. But the woods were no longer a safe place. The shadows moved aggressively now, slithering between trees like living things. Eyes shone from every direction. They barricaded themselves in the cabin, listening as footsteps circled outside for hours. When morning finally came, they packed whatever they could and headed toward the road, sticking together tightly. After hours of hiking, they emerged onto a gravel path. In the distance, a truck passed by, a sign of civilization. Mark called 911, his hands trembling. The police arrived and searched the area, but found no trace of Rachel or the robed figures. The locals were tight-lipped when Mark asked about strange occurrences. One old man muttered about the old woods and things that don't like to be disturbed. Rachel was never found. Mark, Jake, and Lisa left the forest changed, haunted by the things they couldn't explain. Sometimes, late at night, Mark thinks he hears that chanting, faint but unmistakable, calling from the darkness. Story the end. The sun had already dipped below the horizon when Mark and his friends reached the edge of the woods. The small town of Cedar Hollow was nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forest, and the patch of trees before them was among the oldest, thickest stretches of wilderness within 100 miles. Mark was new to the town, having just moved for a job at the local paper mill. The others, Jason, Tom, and Rachel, had lived there their whole lives and were eager to show him the secrets of the woods, at least the ones they were willing to talk about. "We're not going too deep tonight," Jason said, his flashlight slicing through the growing darkness, "just enough to check out the old logging trail and maybe find that abandoned cabin." Mark felt a thrill. He had grown up in a city and rarely spent time outdoors after dark, but the idea of exploring deep woods gave him a strange mixture of excitement and unease. The air smelled damp and earthy, and an eerie silence pressed in around them, broken only by the crunch of their boots on dead leaves and twigs. Rachel led the way, carrying a small backpack with snacks and a first aid kit. Tom followed closely behind her, and Jason brought up the rear. Mark tried to keep his nerves under control, reminding himself it was just a forest, nothing supernatural or scary. They walked for nearly an hour along the old trail. The narrow path, lined with gnarled trees, twisted deeper into the woods than Mark had ever ventured. Shadows lengthened and warped. Branches creaked overhead like sighs in the wind, and the occasional snap of a twig made him jump. "You guys sure this cabin is still around?" Mark asked, trying to sound casual. Jason grinned. "Yep. It's been abandoned for decades, used to belong to some hermit who disappeared one winter. People say the place is haunted, but it's just stories." Rachel shot him a warning glance, but Jason just shrugged. "Come on, it's just a creepy old shack." They finally reached a clearing where the cabin stood, half hidden by thick brush and twisted vines. The wood was rotting, windows broken, door hanging off its hinges. An oppressive stillness settled over the place, and Mark's heart pounded louder in his ears. "Let's check it out," Tom said, stepping toward the door. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they stepped inside. Dust floated in the flashlight beams, settling on old furniture and broken glass. The smell of mold and decay filled the air. "Looks like no one's been here in a long time," Rachel whispered. Mark's eyes caught something strange on the far wall, a series of crude symbols scratched into the wood, dark and jagged, like some kind of warning. He took a step closer. "What do you think that means?" he asked. Jason shrugged. "Probably some dumb graffiti, kids messing around decades ago." But Rachel's face grew pale. "I don't like this. Let's just take some pictures and get out." Mark nodded, eager to leave the cabin behind. As he snapped photos, a sudden cold draft swept through the room, and he felt an icy shiver run down his spine. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from outside. The cabin door slammed shut with a violent force. The four friends jumped, their flashlights darting toward the sound. Jason rushed to the door and tried to open it, but it was stuck fast. "Someone's messing with us," Tom said nervously. "Or maybe the wind." Mark didn't buy it. The wind was calm, and the sound was too deliberate. A sense of dread crept over him. Then they heard it. Faint footsteps crunching on the leaves outside, circling the cabin. "Who's out there?" Rachel called, voice trembling. No answer. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. Mark's flashlight flickered once, then died. "Damn it!" Jason cursed, shaking the light. He tried again, but it was dead. "Everyone stay calm," Tom said, pulling out his phone. No signal. Mark's breath came fast. The oppressive silence wrapped around them like a shroud. Then a voice, low and rasping, whispered just outside the window. "Leave. Now." The four friends froze. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered. Jason moved to the window and peered outside, but all he could see was darkness and swaying branches. "Probably just some drunk guy playing tricks," Jason said, trying to sound brave. But Mark felt otherwise. He felt watched. The feeling was almost suffocating. Suddenly, the door rattled violently. Something or someone was trying to get in. "Get away from the door," Mark shouted. They huddled together in the corner as the pounding grew more frantic, the wood splintering. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence returned. Mark's heart hammered in his chest. Something was very wrong. "We need to get out," Rachel said urgently. Jason shook the door hard again, finally managing to pry it open just enough to slip through. Outside, the woods seemed darker, the shadows deeper, almost alive. They ran without looking back, branches clawing at their faces, roots threatening to trip them. After what felt like an eternity, they burst onto the edge of the forest, gasping for breath. The streetlights of Cedar Hollow flickered in the distance, a safe beacon. Jason laughed nervously. "See? Just an old cabin. No big deal." Mark glanced back at the tree line. Something glinted in the darkness, a pair of eyes reflecting the faint moonlight, watching. He swallowed hard. "Let's never go back," he said. Days passed, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Strange things happened. The trail they'd taken to the cabin seemed to shift when he tried to find it again. He'd hear noises outside his window at night, footsteps crunching on the gravel. His dreams were haunted by dark figures lurking just beyond the trees, whispering his name. One evening, he found a scrap of weathered paper slipped under his door. On it, the same symbols from the cabin, crudely drawn in black ink. Panic clenched his chest. He showed it to Rachel the next day. "We need to warn people," she said. "Maybe the town elders know something." But when they asked around, the older residents grew tight-lipped, eyes clouded with unease. "There are things in these woods," one man muttered, "things best left alone." Mark tried to forget, but the woods had marked him. Weeks later, after a long shift at the mill, he stopped by the local diner where Jason and Rachel were waiting. "Hey, you guys heard about Tom?" Jason asked, voice grim. "What? No. What happened?" Mark's stomach dropped. "He's missing," Rachel said. "Last seen near the edge of the woods." The small town was thrown into a frenzy. Search parties combed the forest, but no sign of Tom was found. Mark couldn't believe it. The fear he'd tried to bury bubbled to the surface. One night, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He answered hesitantly. A raspy voice whispered, "You shouldn't have gone there." The line went dead. Mark's hands shook. Desperate for answers, he decided to return to the cabin. Alone. Armed with a flashlight and a pocket knife, he retraced the old trail. The forest was oppressive, the darkness thicker than ink. He reached the clearing. The cabin looked worse than before, almost swallowed by vines. As he stepped inside, the cold hit him like a wave. The symbols on the wall seemed to pulse in the flashlight's beam. Suddenly, a figure darted past the broken window. Mark spun, heart racing, but saw nothing. Then a guttural growl echoed from the woods. He ran. Branches whipped at his face. The footsteps were behind him, heavy and fast. He tripped, hitting the ground hard. As he scrambled to his feet, something grabbed his ankle. He kicked and twisted, breaking free, and sprinted blindly until he burst out of the trees and into the town's dim streetlights. Panting, he looked back. The forest was silent. But as he reached his front porch, he noticed something chilling, muddy footprints leading from the woods up to his door. Mark never went back into those woods. And every night, he could swear he heard footsteps outside, circling his house, waiting. Story the end. The last person to live in the old Denham place was a man named Clyde Garrison, and even that was 30 years ago. The house had long since rotted into the underbrush, and the only road leading to it was little more than 2 dirt ruts swallowed by weeds and saplings. You wouldn't find it unless you were looking, and even then, the woods did their best to make sure you missed it. That part of Kentucky, the deep rural hills east of Barberville, had always been cloaked in whispers. My granddad used to say the trees there didn't grow crooked by accident. In late October of 2019, I joined 2 friends, Daniel and Chris, on what was supposed to be a 3-day hiking and backwoods camping trip. Chris had studied Appalachian trails obsessively and found an old, unofficial route that looped deep into the hills. It wasn't on any official hiking map, but he had found it through an online forum of hardcore bushcrafters. That was Chris for you. If it wasn't obscure, dangerous, or completely off-grid, he wasn't interested. We parked Daniel's truck at a pull-off beside a crumbling mile marker on a road that hadn't seen fresh asphalt since the 80s. The trail was nearly invisible, more animal path than hiking trail. After the first hour of navigating overgrown thickets and hopping fallen logs, I was already questioning why I'd agreed to this. But Daniel and Chris were both all smiles, oblivious to how the trees pressed in around us like walls, how quiet it had become. The further we hiked, the more the birds fell silent, the more it felt like sound itself was being muffled. We made camp the first night by a stream. It was the kind of cold where the air stung your nostrils, but not cold enough to snow. We had a fire, whiskey, and stories. Chris brought up the Denham place that night. "You know," he said, poking the fire with a stick, "we're only a couple miles from it." "From what?" I asked. "The Denham property. Garrison's place." Daniel grunted. "That guy who killed his whole family or something?" Chris shrugged. "There are like 3 versions. One says he went crazy and poisoned his kin, buried them in the root cellar. Another says they all got sick from some fungus, and he was found out of his mind, chewing on his own fingers. But the weirdest one says he didn't kill anyone, says he came back out of the woods alone, raving about something watching them from the trees, something old." I laughed, but it came out nervous. So naturally, you brought us right next to it. Chris smiled. You wouldn't have come otherwise. That night, I couldn't sleep. The woods felt wrong. It was too quiet. No owls, no rustling leaves, just the faint crackle of dying firewood. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard someone walking near the edge of camp. Footsteps slow and heavy like someone dragging a leg. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. Chris and Daniel were still asleep. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just silence. In the morning, I didn't say anything. What was I going to say? Hey guys, I thought I heard a one-legged cryptid creeping around camp last night. I let it go. The second day we moved deeper. The path was steeper, and the air felt damp. We passed an old stone well, half collapsed and filled with brackish water. None of us drank from it. The trees here grew too tall and too close. There was barely any sunlight. I remember stopping once and realizing I couldn't hear the others. I turned and they were both just standing behind me, staring at something in the distance. I looked where they were looking, but saw nothing, just trees and brambles. Do you see that? Chris asked. See what? He blinked, then shook his head. Never mind. We set up camp early that night because we couldn't find a flat clearing big enough for all 3 tents. We ended up sleeping close together under a rocky outcropping. Daniel cooked a small meal and we ate in near silence. Everyone felt it. Something was wrong out here. Just after midnight, I woke up needing to piss. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and stepped into the freezing night. I took maybe 10 steps from camp when I heard someone whisper my name. It came from the trees, soft and slow. Not Chris, not Daniel. This voice was lower, like gravel being ground underfoot. I froze. I turned toward the sound and saw something move behind a tree, just far enough that I couldn't see details. Tall, pale, too skinny to be a person. I bolted back to camp. Chris sat up as I stumbled into the light of the fire. You saw it too, he said. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. The third day, Daniel wanted to head back. He looked pale and his hands were shaking. Chris insisted we were closer to the truck if we kept on the loop trail, but Daniel refused. Eventually, Chris gave in, but he was agitated the whole hike. He kept glancing over his shoulder, stopping to listen to things we couldn't hear. We didn't make it back. Somewhere around noon, the trail vanished. We should have been walking west, but the sun stayed in the same place above us. Then the trees started looking familiar, too familiar. We passed that same moss-covered stump 3 times. We were lost. Chris tried to act like it was no big deal, but his mask cracked around dusk when he realized his compass needle was spinning. There's iron in the soil, he muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. That night we didn't bother with a fire. We huddled together and tried to sleep, but something walked the perimeter of our camp all night. Soft footsteps, the occasional crack of a branch. At one point, I saw a shape watching us from the dark, tall and unmoving. I closed my eyes and pretended not to see it. By morning, Daniel was gone. We woke up and his sleeping bag was empty. No sign of struggle, no blood, no footprints. Just gone. We searched for hours, calling his name. Chris kept saying it didn't make sense, that Daniel wouldn't leave without telling us, that he was scared last night and would have clung to us like a shadow. But he was gone. Just gone. By late afternoon, Chris broke down. I'd never seen him cry before. He kept mumbling, "This wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't supposed to happen." We stumbled on an old clearing that evening, overgrown but clearly unnatural. The stumps of wooden beams stuck out from the moss-covered ground like ribs. The remains of a foundation. The Denham house. It had to be. Chris didn't want to stop, but I refused to keep walking. We hadn't eaten in a day and a half. We were exhausted. We made a fire and sat with our backs to the remains of the foundation. I could feel something watching from the woods, just past the firelight. Every time I looked, I saw nothing, but I felt it. Chris finally spoke. "I've read about places like this," he said. "Spots where the boundary is thin, where things seep through. Some people say it's the land itself. Others think it's older than that. I thought it was just a story. What do we do?" He looked at me, eyes hollow. "We wait." I didn't sleep that night. Just before dawn, Chris stood up and walked into the woods. No flashlight, no backpack, nothing. I called after him, screamed his name, but he didn't stop. I heard him for a while, twigs snapping, brush rustling, then silence. I waited until full daylight before I moved. I walked in the direction he went for hours but found nothing. Eventually, I gave up. I tried retracing our steps, tried finding the trail. Nothing worked. The forest seemed to twist around me. Even when I walked in a straight line, I'd end up back at that damn foundation. I stayed there 2 more days, I think. Time was strange. I slept in bursts. I heard voices, sometimes Daniel's, sometimes my mom's. Once, I swear I heard myself calling for help, always from the woods, always just far enough that I couldn't quite make out the words. On the third day, again, I think it was the third, I woke up to the sound of a chainsaw. I ran toward it, crashing through brush, sobbing. I found a group of hunters, 3 men in camo standing beside a gutted buck. They looked at me like I was a ghost. I collapsed at their feet. The local authorities found my truck, then our first campsite. They never found Daniel or Chris. The official story was that they got lost and probably succumbed to the elements. Maybe even fell down a ravine or were taken by a bear. But I know better. Something is out there in that stretch of woods where the trees grow too tall and too close. Something that doesn't like being seen but doesn't mind watching. I can still feel its eyes on me when I sleep. Sometimes I hear it in dreams, whispering my name in that gravel voice. I moved across the country, changed my number, cut ties with Chris's online hiking forums, but I know it's still out there, waiting. And I know I wasn't supposed to leave. Story the end. The late summer heat still clung to the air when Aaron and Jenna decided to take their usual weekend trip into the woods behind their family's old farm. It was the kind of place where the trees grew so thick and tall that sunlight barely touched the ground, a forest so dense it seemed to swallow sound whole. For years they had explored the trails and creeks, hunting for wild berries, climbing rocks, and skipping stones across the dark water. Aaron loved those woods. They were a refuge from the chaos of city life, the endless noise and rush. Jenna wasn't quite as enthusiastic, but she humored him every time, tagging along out of loyalty and a need to escape herself. That Friday afternoon, they packed the old Jeep with tents, a cooler, and a couple of fishing rods. The plan was to camp at a small clearing near the creek, where the map marked an old hunting cabin that had long been abandoned. Aaron was eager to show Jenna the spot. It was his secret little getaway. The drive down the gravel road was rough but familiar, rattling their bones and kicking up dust. As the Jeep slowed to a crawl near the trailhead, Aaron glanced at Jenna and smiled. "Ready for a weekend off the grid?" She nodded, her brow furrowed with a mix of excitement and something else. Unease, maybe. The trail itself was narrow, barely wider than the Jeep. Branches scraped against the windows and wildflowers lined the edge, half hidden by weeds and fallen leaves. The forest around them seemed alive, dense with thick underbrush and ancient oaks. They both felt that strange stillness that only deep woods could bring, the kind of quiet that presses down on your chest. After parking near the old clearing, they unpacked and set off on foot, backpacks snug and boots sinking into soft dirt. Aaron led, confident on the winding paths, while Jenna kept a steady pace, scanning the shadows. They reached the creek by early evening. The water gurgled gently over smooth stones, reflecting the fiery hues of sunset. The cabin was just as Aaron had described, a small, sagging wooden structure, half concealed by vines and moss, its windows cracked and dirt-streaked. Inside, the air smelled damp and musty. The floorboards creaked beneath their boots. Broken furniture lay strewn about, and the fireplace held the remnants of charred logs from long ago. Aaron found an old, rusted lantern and managed to get it working with some matches from their pack. As darkness fell, the forest closed in, and the stars blinked cold and distant above. They built a fire outside, its flickering light casting dancing shadows against the trees. Aaron cracked open a beer while Jenna roasted marshmallows, trying to shake off the creeping chill that wasn't just the temperature dropping. "So you really think anyone comes out here anymore?" Jenna asked, eyes fixed on the fire. "Hardly. The cabin's been abandoned for decades. The last hunter who lived here left in the early 90s. Nobody's bothered with this place since." Jenna nodded, but her fingers tightened around the marshmallow stick. "It feels wrong, like we're being watched." Aaron laughed. "You're just spooked. The woods play tricks on your mind." They talked late into the night about old family stories and childhood memories. The fire crackled, and the forest around them was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. But then, around midnight, the silence shattered. Jenna froze as a soft noise pierced the night, faint footsteps crunching on dry leaves just beyond the firelight. Aaron's face tightened. "Did you hear that?" Jenna nodded. "Someone's out there." They both stood, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Aaron grabbed a flashlight from his pack and swept the beam across the trees. The light flickered over gnarled roots and thick trunks, but nothing moved. "Probably a deer," Aaron said, though his voice lacked conviction. Jenna wasn't convinced. That didn't sound like an animal. Minutes passed, tense and silent except for the fire's dying crackle. Then the footsteps started again, slower this time, deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing. Aaron shone the flashlight directly into the woods, but the beam was swallowed by darkness. He cursed softly and reached for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Stay close," he whispered. They edged toward the cabin, moving quietly. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows. Jenna gasped and stumbled backward. The growl rose into a harsh, raspy breathing. Aaron shone the light again, and through the trees, he saw it, a figure, hunched and massive, its eyes reflecting a sinister yellow. The thing didn't move like any animal he had ever seen. Its limbs twisted at odd angles, and its face was obscured by thick fur, but there was something human in its posture. It snarled, baring sharp, broken teeth. "Run!" Aaron yelled. They sprinted toward the jeep, branches whipping their faces. Behind them, the growls multiplied, followed by heavy footsteps pounding the earth. Aaron's heart thundered in his chest as he threw open the driver's door and slammed inside. Jenna scrambled into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, but the headlights barely penetrated the thick darkness ahead. The thing burst from the tree line, tall and terrible, blocking the narrow road just ahead. Aaron slammed the brakes hard, the jeep skidding in the gravel. The creature roared, lunging toward the windshield with claws scraping glass. Jenna screamed, clutching Aaron's arm. With a desperate twist, Aaron shifted into reverse and floored the gas. The jeep leapt backward, spinning wildly before straightening out. They tore down the road, branches whipping past, heartbeats pounding in their ears. After what felt like an eternity, the forest thinned, and lights of a distant farmhouse appeared. They didn't stop until the jeep was parked behind the porch and the engine was dead. The farmhouse door creaked open, and an old man stepped out, holding a lantern. "You boys all right?" he asked, eyes sharp and tired. We were attacked," Aaron gasped. The man nodded grimly. "The woods get hungry sometimes. You did well to get out." Inside, they learned the old man's name was Caleb. He'd lived on the edge of those woods for over 40 years, tending to his land and warning travelers to stay clear after dark. He told them about the creature, a legend passed down from the native tribes and old settlers, a guardian of the forest that protected its secrets and punished those who trespassed. Caleb handed Aaron a worn talisman carved from bone. "Keep this close," he said. "It won't stop the creature, but it might keep you safe a little longer." That night, Aaron and Jenna stayed in the farmhouse, too shaken to return to their jeep. But the woods outside seemed to whisper and shift under the moonlight, promising that the forest's hunger was far from sated. By dawn, they packed and left, vowing never to return. Years later, Aaron would tell the story with a shiver, warning anyone who would listen. Some woods don't want you to come in, and if you do, they might never let you leave. Story, the end. The sun was dipping behind the dense pines by the time I reached the edge of the property. The dirt road I'd been following for the last hour narrowed into a barely visible path, swallowed by the towering trees that crowded in on both sides. The forest here wasn't like the parks or preserves I'd hiked before. It was ancient, tangled, with undergrowth and vines, and every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer than it should. This was the kind of woods people warned you about. Places whispered in old local stories, but never really talked about. I didn't believe in those stories, not until that night. My name is Rachel, and I had agreed to join a remote research trip for a few weeks. The job was simple: document the flora and fauna in this patch of wilderness before a logging company came through to clear large sections of the forest. I was supposed to be part of a team, but the others were delayed or canceled, and I was the first to arrive at the cabin that served as our base camp. It was a rickety old thing, with peeling paint and windows like black eyes staring out into the dark. The cabin was nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering oaks and firs, and the silence was almost suffocating. I set up my equipment and tried to shake the growing feeling that I'd stumbled into a place I wasn't supposed to be. The locals had called this area Whisper Hollow, a name that should have raised red flags for me. Instead, I just told myself it was because of the wind rattling through the trees, or maybe the way animals communicated here. But as dusk settled, something felt off. That night, I lay awake listening. The forest was supposed to be alive with crickets and owls and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. But instead, there was only silence. I heard a faint sound, almost like whispering, but it was so soft I thought it might be my imagination. I reached for my flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the thick darkness outside. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, not the clumsy shuffle of a deer or the scurry of a raccoon, but heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I froze, holding my breath as the sound passed just beyond the window. I dared not look, but the hairs on my arms stood on end. The steps moved away, fading into silence. The next morning, I told myself I must have been dreaming or suffering from exhaustion. But when I stepped outside, I found strange footprints in the damp earth circling the cabin, prints that were too large and oddly shaped to belong to any animal I knew. They were spaced unevenly, like whoever or whatever had made them was limping or dragging something. I decided to explore deeper into the forest, hoping the daylight would bring some clarity. As I followed a narrow trail, the trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting in unnatural angles. The air was heavy, and the sun filtered through the leaves in scattered, weak beams. I reached a small clearing and immediately felt a prickling at the back of my neck. There was a circle of stones arranged haphazardly, with scraps of old cloth tied to nearby branches. The cloth was faded and tattered, stained with something dark. I stepped closer and noticed strange symbols carved into the bark of the surrounding trees. Spirals, jagged lines, and what looked like crude faces. A sudden chill ran through me. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but the screen flickered and went black. I tried turning it on again, but there was no response. I felt exposed, cut off from help, as if the forest itself was swallowing the technology and the world beyond its borders. Back at the cabin, I found the front door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. Inside, everything was just as I'd left it, except for my notes, which were scattered across the floor as if someone had rifled through them. There was a faint odor, a mix of damp earth and something metallic. My heart pounded as I checked every window and corner. Nothing else was out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, the whispers returned. They weren't words, but a low murmur, like a crowd speaking just beyond comprehension. I sat by the fireplace, shotgun in hand, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. A cold gust swept inside, extinguishing the fire and sending papers flying. I raced to close the door, but the moment my hands touched the handle, I heard breathing behind me, slow, labored, and chilling. I spun around, swinging the shotgun, but there was nothing there. The air was icy, and my breath came out in misty clouds. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. I fled outside into the forest, heart pounding, trying to find my way back to the car. But the woods had changed. Paths I was sure I'd followed were gone, replaced by thick brambles or deep shadows. The trees seemed to lean in closer, branches clawing at my clothes. The whispers turned to growls and then to screams, echoing from every direction. I stumbled blindly until I collapsed near a fallen log, too exhausted to move. As I caught my breath, I noticed something glowing faintly among the roots, a pair of eyes, unblinking and filled with a terrible hunger. The creature stepped into the light, revealing a gaunt figure with skin stretched tight over sharp bones, limbs unnaturally long, and a mouth that stretched far too wide in a grotesque grin. Frozen with fear, I watched it approach, each step silent, despite the weight. The last thing I remember was its cold hand reaching for me before everything went black. When I awoke, I was back in the clearing near the cabin, my clothes torn and bloodied. My phone was dead, and the first light of dawn was filtering through the canopy. I had no memory of how I got there or how long I'd been unconscious. I tried to leave again, but the forest refused. Every time I thought I found the edge, the trees shifted, the shadows deepened, and the silence swallowed me whole. At night, the whispers continued, and sometimes I swear I see that creature watching from the darkness, waiting. I don't know if anyone will ever find me. Maybe I'm trapped in this place forever. A lost soul swallowed by the deep woods, where the shadows whisper and the forest never lets go. Story the end. It started with a phone call from my cousin Alan. We weren't especially close growing up, but our families kept in touch enough that I knew his voice immediately. He was whispering, frantic, saying he needed help. Said he was stuck at his grandfather's old hunting cabin in the rural stretch of Maine where cell towers didn't reach and where paved roads ended in dirt and gravel long before any house came into view. "You need to come get me," he said. "I can't leave on my own." I asked him what was going on, and he hesitated. Then he said, "There's something in the woods. It comes out after dark." I asked if he'd called the police. He said he did 2 nights ago, and they sent someone out, but no one ever showed up. "There's no one left to call," he whispered. "Please, you're the only one I trust." Against better judgment, and because Alan had once pulled me out of a frozen lake when we were kids, I agreed. I took 2 days off work, gassed up my truck, and headed north. He'd given me rough directions, hand-drawn on a scanned napkin image he emailed before his reception dropped. By the time I crossed into the rural outskirts, dusk was already settling in, and a thick fog was rolling across the treetops like a warning. I found the dirt turnoff around 8 p.m. It wasn't on any GPS or map, just a break in the trees barely wider than my truck. It led me 10 miles deeper into the wilderness. No lights, no signs, just a single-lane trail surrounded by thick evergreens and birch trees that leaned in as though to listen. I passed 2 collapsed barns, one burnt-out truck shell, and what looked like an animal trap chained to a stump. Then finally, just as my headlights cut across a clearing, I saw it. The cabin was more like a large shack built with thick, untreated logs, its roof sagging under years of snow and rot. One window had plywood nailed over it. The other was cracked, with something dark smeared across the inside. Alan stepped out as I pulled up. He looked thinner than I remembered, gaunt, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. "You made it," he said, rushing to open the passenger door and waving me inside. "We don't have much time," I laughed nervously. "For what? You want to get out of here tonight?" "No, we can't. It's already too late." He ushered me into the cabin and bolted the door behind me. Inside, it was chaos. Furniture had been pushed against the windows. There were runes carved into the wood beams above the fireplace and jars of what looked like salt placed in each corner. A line of crushed red berries had been smeared in a circle around the room. The air smelled like pine and rot. Alan locked the door with a padlock and 2 chains. "We have to stay in until sunrise. Just don't open the door, no matter what you hear." I was too stunned to argue. Once the fire was lit and the room warmed, he explained. A week ago, he'd come up to clean the place and spend a weekend hunting. On the second night, he saw someone, or something, standing at the edge of the woods just beyond the clearing. Said it was tall. Not just tall, but unnatural. Like its arms were too long and its head tilted at a wrong angle. He shouted. It didn't move, just stood there watching. The next day, he found deer carcasses strung up in trees, their entrails missing. That night, he heard whispering outside the cabin. Said it sounded like his mother. She died 3 years ago. "She kept saying she was cold," he said, not meeting my eyes. "She begged me to let her in." After that, every night was worse. The creature came closer. Sometimes it circled the cabin. Sometimes it knocked on the walls. Once it left a tooth, human-looking, but filed to a point, on the windowsill. "I tried leaving on the 3rd day," he said. "But every path I took just brought me back here. The woods don't let you leave." He said he heard others now. More than one voice. Whispers in the trees. Footsteps on the roof. I asked if he'd been eating. He gestured toward a can of beans and an unopened granola bar. I shook my head and told him he probably needed sleep and hydration, maybe medical help. But as night crept in and the fire dimmed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something outside was watching. Just before midnight I heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on the wooden door. Alan froze, eyes wide, finger to his lips. Another knock, then a voice. "Alan," it said. A woman's voice, soft and warm like honey and memory. "It's me. Open the door, baby. I'm cold." I stared at him, whispering, "That's your mother's voice?" He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. Then another voice joined. A man this time. "You brought someone with you. Is that your cousin? Let him in, too." Then came the scraping, like nails on bark, dragging across the outer walls. Something moved past the window. I caught a glimpse of a shape. Tall. Gaunt. Bent at the waist like a hunchback, its hands brushing the ground. Its head moved in short jerks like it couldn't hold its weight up. I backed away from the door. Alan poured a circle of salt around us both and whispered something over and over, maybe a prayer. The scratching continued until nearly dawn. Then silence. When the sun rose, we went outside. There were tracks around the cabin, long, wide, clawed footprints, some animal-like, some human. And the trees, every trunk within 10 feet of the cabin, was marked with vertical slashes as if something had raked its fingers down them. We tried to leave again that morning, walking for hours in what should have been a straight line toward the truck. But after almost 4 hours, we circled back to the cabin. The same clearing, the same trees. My truck still sitting out front. "This place doesn't let you leave once it sees you," Alan whispered. "Once you know it's real." I didn't believe him, refused to believe him. So I tried something desperate. I tied a scarf to a tree, walked a straight line in one direction, marking every third tree with my knife. After an hour, I found the same scarf tied to the same tree. My own boot prints crossed over themselves. That night, things changed. The knocking came earlier. Voices I recognized called out, my sister, my ex-girlfriend, my father, all of them saying things only they would know. One voice said my childhood nickname. Another called out about a secret I'd never told anyone, something I'd done when I was 10 that still haunted me. My skin crawled. Around midnight, we heard them on the roof, heavy footsteps, one by one, slow, slow as if pacing. Then a thud, something landing just outside the door. We didn't open it. Couldn't. Then came the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. The doorknob turning. It was locked, chained, but it still turned. Something was twisting it with slow, deliberate force. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. Instead, Alan stood and whispered, "They're testing us. Don't say anything." The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices, chanting, crying, moaning, laughing, all around the cabin. Then a shriek, so loud and inhuman it made my ears ring. And then, nothing. The next morning, the truck was gone, just gone. No tire tracks, no sign it had ever been there. Alan didn't even react, just nodded slowly and said, "They know you're staying now." For 3 more nights we stayed locked in, surviving on canned food and bottled water. The voices never stopped. They mimicked people I loved, begged, screamed. One voice said Alan was already dead, that I was talking to his ghost. Another said I never left my apartment, that I was in a coma, and this was all a dream. On the 5th day, Alan said he wanted to try something. Said if I stayed in the salt circle, he'd go out and see if there was a way to break whatever was holding us here. I tried to argue, but he was already unbolting the door. As soon as he stepped out, something grabbed him. It was fast, quicker than I could process, a blur of black and limbs and shrieking. He screamed once, then was dragged into the woods. I didn't move for hours. When night came, the voices didn't speak. Just footsteps, hundreds of them circling the cabin. They didn't knock. They didn't call, just circled. At dawn, I ran. I didn't know where to go, just away from the cabin. I ran until my lungs burned, until I collapsed on a slope and rolled. When I woke up, a man in an orange vest was kneeling over me, a hiker. He helped me up, called for help on his satellite phone. When I told the ranger where I'd been, he stared at me for a long time and then said, "That area's been off limits for decades. People go missing. Dogs won't even go in." They found no trace of Alan, no cabin, no footprints, nothing. But I know what I saw. And sometimes at night, when I close my eyes, I hear my mother's voice whispering just beyond the door, "Let me in. I'm cold." Story the end. When I was 23, I took a job out in rural Missouri working as a field technician for a private ecological research company. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the solitude. My assignment was to survey forested land in the Mark Twain National Forest region, setting up trail cams, collecting soil and water samples, tracking wildlife populations. The company had a long-term lease on a section of unincorporated land way out there. No official address, no cell coverage, just miles of barely marked backroads and thick woods. I stayed in a one-room cabin they'd set up decades ago for rotating workers like me. It had no electricity, just a generator that sputtered on good days and a propane tank for heating water. I didn't mind the isolation. In fact, that was what I liked most. People made me anxious, but I never thought the forest would be worse. The first week passed without much incident. I got used to waking up at dawn with the birds, logging animal tracks, installing camera traps, hauling water from a nearby stream. There were moments it felt almost peaceful. But as the second week rolled in, things began to feel off. It started small. I'd find my tools moved. Nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts. A spade left upright when I'd laid it flat, my backpack zipper undone, fresh soil on the cabin floor in the mornings. I wrote it off as forgetfulness at first. I was exhausted most nights. I assumed I was slipping up, but something about it didn't sit right. One night, I came back after a long day setting up cameras near an outcrop about 3 miles away. It was already dark when I returned. I unlocked the cabin and froze in the doorway. My cot had been moved. Not just nudged, shifted almost a foot to the right. My gear was piled in the corner, not how I'd left it. The lantern, which I always kept on the window ledge, was sitting in the middle of the floor. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I drove back to the ranger station 40 miles out and reported what I thought might be a break-in. The ranger, a man in his 60s named Howell, listened without interrupting. He looked down at my map, nodded slowly. "You're up in Hollow Branch, right?" he said. "Yeah, that's the sector I'm assigned." He rubbed his jaw, thinking, "There ain't supposed to be anyone up there. Closest property's about 12 miles east. Some old widow, name's May something. Don't think she even drives anymore." "So, squatters?" I asked. "Maybe," he said, but didn't sound convinced. "You packing anything?" "Just bear spray." He paused, then reached into his desk and handed me a rusty flare gun. "Take this, just in case." I didn't want to overreact, but the whole interaction rattled me. Howell had seemed nervous. I drove back, tried to ignore the feeling gnawing at the back of my neck. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps on the porch. Heavy ones. Not animal. Deliberate. I didn't have a window facing the porch, but I could hear the boards creaking, slow and careful. Something brushed against the door. I held the flare gun in my lap, barely breathing. Then came a sound I can still hear sometimes when I close my eyes. A low whistle. 2 notes, soft and slow, like someone calling a dog. It lasted a few seconds. Then silence. I sat there until morning, never hearing anything else. When I finally stepped outside, there were footprints in the dirt. Bare feet. Human. I was ready to leave. I packed what I could and drove out, only to find a massive tree felled across the road 2 miles out. The timing felt too precise to be coincidence. I hacked at it with a hatchet for over an hour, but the trunk was thick and the sun was already dropping. I went back to the cabin, telling myself I'd hike out in the morning and call Howell from the ranger station. That night, the woods went silent. I mean, completely dead. No crickets, no owls, not even wind. Just stillness so deep it made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard the whistle again. 2 notes, this time closer. Then I heard my name. It came from behind the cabin, soft and garbled, like someone trying to imitate my voice. "Jake." I didn't respond. I didn't even look. I stayed crouched in the corner until the sky turned gray with dawn. The next day I hiked. Left everything behind except my keys, a bottle of water, the flare gun. I stayed off the roads, cut through the woods. It was slow going, but I thought if I could get high enough, I might pick up signal. Around noon, I came across something that made my stomach drop. A campsite. Old, overgrown, but not ancient. There were shredded tarps tangled in the underbrush, a crushed metal cooler, scattered clothing, a child's jacket half buried under leaves, and bones, not animal, human. They were half exposed, picked clean. The skull was cracked like it had been bludgeoned. A rusted camp stove sat beside a log, its tank torn open. I turned and ran. I didn't care what direction, just away. I wandered for hours, lungs burning, until I hit a dry creek bed and followed it. That's when I found the camera. It was one of mine, a trail cam. I'd placed it 4 days ago near a deer path. It was still latched to the tree, red light blinking. I took out the memory card and kept walking. Eventually, I made it to the ranger station. Hal wasn't there, but another ranger drove me into town. I didn't say much. I was half crazed from exhaustion and fear. That night in a motel, I loaded the camera's footage onto my laptop. At first, just trees, deer, a raccoon sniffing the lens. Then, just after 2 a.m. on the second night, a figure appeared. It was tall, too tall, dressed in filthy clothes or maybe rags hanging in tatters. Its limbs were long, wrong somehow, elbows bending too far backward, joints twitching in odd angles. It didn't walk, it crawled fast and low toward the camera. Right before it reached the lens, it looked up. Its face was a mess of shadows, but what I could see, its mouth was open wide, unnaturally wide, and its eyes were tiny black dots. It paused, tilted its head, and let out that same two-note whistle. Then the screen went black. I gave the footage to the authorities. They said they'd investigate, but I never heard back. I don't think they even knew where to look. That cabin doesn't appear on any modern maps. The access road was removed from GPS years ago. I left Missouri after that, moved to a city, never went back into the woods. But sometimes, late at night, I dream I'm still there, that I'm back in that cabin, that I hear the whistle again. Sometimes I wake up and swear I see footprints outside my apartment window. Sometimes I think whatever I saw followed me back. Story the end. It was a late September weekend when my friends and I decided to escape the city and go camping deep in the woods of northern Pennsylvania. We wanted something remote, away from the usual crowded state parks and noisy trails. The idea was to find a spot off the beaten path, where the forest felt wild and untouched, a place where the only signs of life were the trees, animals, and the faint sound of the wind. I'd grown up camping, and so had my friends, but none of us had ever been this far into the backcountry. We found the spot through a local hiking forum, an unmarked trail that led to a clearing surrounded by old-growth pines and hardwoods. The map was vague, just a rough sketch shared by some guy who called himself Trail Ghost. His posts warned about the difficulty of the terrain and advised bringing plenty of supplies. None of us took it seriously, but there was a strange undertone in the messages, almost like he was daring people to go there. The three of us, me, Jake, and Lila, started out early Saturday morning with backpacks stuffed full of gear and food. The air was cool and crisp, the kind of chill that hints at the coming fall. The trailhead was just a gravel pull-off next to a barely visible path disappearing into the dense forest. At first, the hike was beautiful. Birds chirping, leaves crunching underfoot, shafts of sunlight breaking through the canopy. We joked, laughed, and made good time, confident we'd reach the clearing before dusk. But the deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trail grew narrower and less defined. The trees crowded in tighter, their branches tangled like grasping hands. The bird song stopped. No squirrels, no rustling in the brush, just silence. The kind of silence that presses down on your chest and makes your skin crawl. At one point, Jake stopped and stared ahead. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Lila and I paused. The forest was still, except for a low rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere up ahead. We couldn't tell what it was. A woodpecker? A branch knocking against a tree? The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving an eerie stillness. We pushed on. The sun was lowering and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. We finally broke through to the clearing just as twilight began to settle. It was exactly as the forum described, surrounded by ancient trees, the ground carpeted with moss and fallen leaves. We set up camp near a cluster of large boulders, started a fire, and tried to shake off the unease creeping over us. That first night, the woods felt alive in an unsettling way. The fire flickered and shadows danced at the edges of the light. Somewhere deep in the forest, a faint, almost musical sound drifted to us on the breeze. It wasn't quite wind, nor an animal call, more like someone humming, distant and melancholic. Lila tried to laugh it off. "It's probably just the wind through the trees," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. We took turns keeping watch. Around midnight, I woke to the crackle of twigs breaking near our camp. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. Nothing. But I swear I saw a figure retreating between the trees, a thin, shadowy shape that melted into the darkness faster than any human could. I shook off the fear and returned to my sleeping bag. The others didn't wake up. The next day, the strange sounds continued. At breakfast, Jake found strange footprints near the edge of the clearing, barefoot but too large and elongated to be human. The prints led toward the denser forest, disappearing abruptly. We debated whether to investigate or just pack up and leave. Curiosity won. We followed the footprints deeper into the woods, where the trees grew even thicker, the light dimmer. The air smelled damp and earthy, like decay. After nearly an hour, we found an old cabin, barely standing, swallowed by vines and moss. The door hung open, creaking on its hinges. Inside, the air was stale. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the walls were covered in strange symbols drawn in charcoal or scratched into the wood. Some looked like ancient runes, others like twisted faces. On the floor, a circle of stones surrounded a withered bundle of sticks and what looked like dried herbs. We didn't stay long. As we left the cabin, the sky darkened unnaturally fast. A thick fog rolled in, swallowing the trees and muffling sounds. We tried to retrace our steps back to camp, but found the path vanished under a blanket of moss and leaf litter. Every direction looked the same: tall trunks, dense undergrowth, a world without edges. Panic started to set in. Lila called out repeatedly, her voice breaking. "We need to find camp! We need to find camp!" Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. It was impossible to tell. Our watches stopped working, frozen at the same time. Phones had no signal and flickered off. The forest seemed to close in on us, shrinking and twisting. We stumbled upon an old graveyard, hidden in a hollow. The tombstones were cracked and tilted, inscriptions nearly erased by time. The air here was colder, heavier. As we crossed the clearing, a low growl rumbled from the thickets, followed by rustling. Something large moved just beyond our sight. We ran. Branches clawed at our faces, roots threatened to trip us. Somewhere behind something followed, a relentless sound of footsteps, breath, snarls. I dared a glance backward and caught a glimpse of eyes, two glowing orbs, bright amber, watching from the dark. We crashed back into our clearing, but it wasn't empty. The fire was out. Our backpacks were ransacked. A chilling wind whipped through the trees, carrying whispers that sounded like laughter and crying all at once. Lila screamed and collapsed, clutching her head. Jake and I tried to calm her, but her eyes rolled back, and she started speaking in a voice that wasn't hers, a low guttural chant in a language I didn't recognize. I grabbed her, shaking her, but she shoved me away with unnatural strength. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. Suddenly, the fire reignited itself, casting flickering shadows that seemed to move with purpose. From the darkness, figures emerged. Tall, gaunt shapes with pale skins stretched tight over bones, faces like masks carved from bark and moss. They circled us, chanting in the same tongue as Lila. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were jerky, unnatural. I pulled Jake, and we ran. Lila followed, no longer chanting, but screaming in a voice desperate and broken. We ran until dawn, until the sun rose and the creatures vanished like smoke. Exhausted and shaken, we found our way back to the truck parked miles away on the gravel road. We never spoke much about what happened that night. Lila left town shortly after, seeking therapy in silence. Jake and I still have trouble sleeping, haunted by glimpses of those pale figures and the eerie chanting that echoes in our dreams. To this day, I refuse to return to those woods. I warn others who seek the quiet wilderness that some places are better left unexplored, where old dark things linger just beyond the edge of firelight, because sometimes the forest watches, and when it's hungry, it reaches out. Story the end. It was fall when I agreed to take care of my cousin Jake's property while he went up north for a job. He owned a small stretch of land deep in the hills of Tennessee, not far from a town called Tellico Plains. The property was nearly 30 acres of rugged forest, winding trails, and a rusted-out A-frame cabin that looked like it had grown out of the mountainside itself. It had no internet, no phone signal, no neighbors for miles, exactly the kind of place Jake loved. For me, it was a change from the city and a chance to clear my head after a rough breakup and losing my job. He needed someone to watch over the place for a few weeks, check the generators, and keep an eye on the hunting trails. I thought it sounded peaceful. The first few days were calm. Mornings were crisp. Fog rolled in through the trees like smoke, and the only sounds came from the wind and the distant calls of crows. I'd wake up, make coffee on the old propane stove, and sit out on the sagging porch as the forest came alive. I brought books, my laptop for offline writing, and a stack of old notebooks Jake had left behind, full of hunting notes, trail sketches, and weather patterns. I liked reading those. They made the place feel lived in. Jake had warned me about coyotes and maybe the odd black bear, but mostly he said to just keep an eye on the cabin and make sure no hikers or hunters wandered onto the land. It bordered a national forest, and folks sometimes ignored signs or got turned around. His dogs had spooked off more than a few trespassers. He didn't say anything about the screaming. It started on the fourth night. I'd gone to bed early, around 10 p.m., and was just drifting off when I heard it, far off at first, a kind of wailing scream that didn't sound quite human but wasn't fully animal either. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. It echoed through the trees in bursts, like it was moving. Then silence. I waited, straining to hear anything more. But the night returned to normal, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, I found broken branches along the western trail behind the cabin. Big ones. Too high for a deer. I thought maybe a black bear had come through, but there were no claw marks, no prints in the soft earth. Just silence. That day, I wandered farther into the woods, following one of Jake's marked trails on an old map. He'd labeled them by color: red trail, blue trail, yellow trail. I took the blue trail, which wound past an old hunting blind and a dried-out creek bed. About an hour in, I found something that made me stop. It was a deer carcass. At first, I thought it had been taken down by a predator, but the cuts were too clean. Its torso was split open and arranged like someone had tried to display it. The organs had been removed, but not eaten. They were missing entirely. What was left had been carefully placed in a circle of stones. I snapped a photo and backed away. I tried to tell myself it was a hunter playing a twisted prank. Maybe kids from town. But no one should have been that far out. Jake's land was clearly posted with warning signs and hadn't been used for hunting in years. Still, I didn't tell anyone. I figured I'd just keep my eyes open and maybe carry the rifle with me next time. That night, the screaming returned. Closer this time. It started just after midnight. I was up reading, flashlight in hand, when it began, a single guttural cry that echoed off the trees. Then a second one, different in pitch but equally unnatural. Then silence again. I didn't sleep after that. The following morning, I hiked back to where I'd found the deer. It was gone. No bones, no blood, no drag marks, just empty ground and the stones still arranged in a perfect circle. I felt like something was watching me the whole time I stood there. The next few days passed in a haze. I tried to stick close to the cabin, did small repairs, collected firewood, and stayed alert. Every night brought more sounds: branches snapping underfoot, soft shuffling noises around the porch, whispers that seemed just beyond my hearing. I stopped going outside after dark altogether. By the seventh day, I was ready to leave. But I didn't. Something about the place felt like it wanted me to stay. Not Jake's cabin exactly, but the woods beyond it. The trails, the trees. I kept thinking I saw someone watching from the tree line, just behind the brush. I'd glance over and they'd vanish. Sometimes I'd find boot prints in the mud near the edge of the porch, even though I never heard anyone approach. Then there was the journal. I found it in the crawl space beneath the cabin while I was trying to check on a pipe Jake mentioned in his instructions. It was wrapped in canvas and tied shut with twine. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but it was clearly Jake's handwriting. Only the tone was off. The entries started normal: hunting logs, weather notes, complaints about generator issues. Then, after a few pages, they turned strange. Saw her again today. Same place, down by the broken pine. She doesn't move right, doesn't blink. Heard the voices in the wall last night. Tried to ignore them. They got louder. The deer was left for me. I didn't take it. I didn't eat it. Why does it think I want it? I read through as much as I could before the pages became unreadable, just symbols and frantic scribbles. That night, something knocked on the cabin door. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I sat in the dark, the rifle on my lap, and waited. Then the door creaked open. I hadn't locked it. I cursed myself silently as it swung inward a few inches, but nothing entered. I waited, and then it closed. Gently. As if whatever had come had changed its mind. I didn't sleep after that either. The next morning, I packed my things. I told myself I was done. I'd leave Jake a note, drop the key with a neighbor in town, and drive back to Knoxville. I loaded the truck and turned the key in the ignition. Nothing. Just a dull click. The battery was dead. I checked under the hood, no signs of damage. The terminals were fine. The lights had worked just that morning, but now the truck was completely lifeless. I hiked 5 miles out to the edge of the nearest road and got a signal long enough to call a tow truck. It would take hours. I walked back to the cabin. That's when I saw the new markings. On the trees, around the porch, carved deep into the bark, symbols like those from Jake's journal. Circles, triangles, crude stick figures with slashed out eyes. I heard movement in the trees, but every time I turned, nothing was there. When I stepped inside the cabin, the journal was gone. The tow truck never arrived. By sunset, my phone had no signal again. I tried the radio. Static. That night, something came inside. I don't remember falling asleep. I don't remember hearing it enter. I just woke up to the sound of breathing. Heavy. Wet. Not far from my face. It was pitch dark. My flashlight was gone. The fire had long since died. I stayed still, held my breath. The breathing circled the bed. I heard something drag along the floor like claws on wood. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, watching, sniffing. Then it spoke. Not in words, just noise, garbled like someone trying to speak underwater. It was close. I felt warmth on my face. Then nothing. When I woke up, it was morning. My boots were gone. So were my bags. The truck was still dead. But the door was wide open. On the ground outside was a single dead squirrel, split open, arranged in the same stone circle as before. I started walking. Didn't pack. Didn't look back. I reached a ranger station by late afternoon. They called the tow truck again. This one showed up. When I returned with them, the cabin was quiet. Nothing was missing, but everything had been moved, rearranged slightly. The table pushed to the side, a chair in the center of the room. The mirror broken. I didn't say anything to the driver, just asked him to get the truck running. When I finally got back to Knoxville, I blocked Jake's number. He still sends texts sometimes, strange ones. Just random words, sometimes just one word over and over again. Stay. I haven't spoken to him since. I don't know if he ever came back. I still dream of the woods, of the screaming, of the breathing, of the voice. I don't go near the forest anymore. And I never, ever leave doors unlocked. Story the end. The sky was a dull gray that morning, low clouds draping over the hills like a shroud, as I turned off the paved highway onto a dirt road that quickly became nothing ruts in the clay. I was headed deep into the heart of rural West Virginia, an area where the only maps you could trust were old, faded paper charts, or the knowledge passed down by locals over campfires and whiskey shots. My destination was a small plot of land inherited from my late grandfather. A cabin, supposedly untouched since he passed 5 years ago. I had never been out there before, but I'd always been curious, maybe a bit reckless, but curiosity had a way of driving people like me. The forest closed in fast, pine and oak crowding either side of the narrow path, the thick canopy blocking what little sunlight the morning had to offer. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of deer or squirrels darting away as my truck rumbled past. I told myself it was peaceful out here, a chance to escape the chaos of the city and clear my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. The cabin appeared suddenly, a squat, weather-beaten structure nestled in a small clearing. Its wooden boards were gray with age, the roof sagging slightly, but it stood firm. I parked the truck beside it, grabbed my bags, and stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of damp earth and moss, the silence so complete it pressed against my ears. I hadn't even realized how loud the truck had been until the forest swallowed the sound behind me. Inside, the cabin was simple but sturdy. Dust coated the furniture, cobwebs hung in corners, and the fireplace was cold and empty. A thin layer of grime covered the floor, but the windows were surprisingly clean, letting in the pale light. I dropped my bags and lit a fire with the kindling I'd brought. There was no cell service, no internet, just me and the woods. That first night, the darkness was different here. It felt thick, almost tangible. I sat by the fire, scribbling in a notebook, trying to capture the quiet beauty of the forest. But as the hours passed, something shifted. The forest outside the cabin seemed to lean closer, shadows dancing just beyond the firelight. I heard a faint rustling from the trees tight, but every time I looked up, there was nothing, just the whisper of leaves and the occasional crack of a twig. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam into the woods. The light caught a pair of eyes staring back at me, reflecting green and unblinking. They disappeared instantly when I blinked. I told myself it was just a deer or an owl, but the unease lingered. The next morning, I explored a little. The forest floor was thick with fallen needles and moss, and every tree was marked with deep scratch marks, some fresh, some older. The deeper I went, the more those scratches appeared, wrapping around trunks like angry scars. I found old hunting traps, rusted and broken, and scattered bones, mostly deer, but a few small animal skulls that looked out of place. The quiet felt oppressive now, like the woods were holding a secret they didn't want me to find. That evening, as twilight settled, I sat on the porch watching the forest edge. The sky was an angry red behind the trees, but something else caught my eye. A figure. Tall, thin, standing motionless just beyond the tree line. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was too dark to see its face, but the way it stood was unnatural. Its shoulders hunched, arms hanging too long. I froze. The figure seemed to shift slightly, a slow, jerking motion that made my skin crawl. Then it stepped back into the trees and vanished. I ran inside and locked the door. I thought about leaving right then, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over weakly, sputtered, then died. I tried again and again, but no luck. I was stuck. That night was the worst. The knocking started around midnight. Slow, deliberate raps on the cabin walls and door. Tap, tap, tap. Then pause. Tap, tap, tap. It went on for what felt like hours. The sound was too heavy for an animal, but too rhythmic for branches. At one point, I heard whispering beneath the knocking. Low voices, almost chanting, words I couldn't understand, but that filled me with dread. I huddled by the fire, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. When I peeked outside, the yard was covered in footprints, large, wide, and barefoot. Some looked human, others elongated and twisted. They circled the cabin, coming close to the door before fading into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. By morning, the air was cold and damp, the sky a slate gray. I found strange symbols etched into the porch steps, triangles and spirals carved deep into the wood, stained dark like dried blood. I had no idea who could have done it or why. Over the next 2 days, I tried to repair the truck, but every time I stepped outside, I felt those eyes watching. The scratching on the trees grew more frequent, deeper, as if whatever lived here was angry or desperate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard a scream. Not human, not animal, a bone-chilling sound that tore through the forest like a knife. It was distant but carried on the wind, sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my things and started walking toward the dirt road, hoping to make it to a neighbor's place or at least find a signal. But the forest had other plans. The trees seemed to close in, paths twisting and looping back on themselves. I walked for hours, disoriented and terrified. My compass spun wildly, useless. The forest was alive, and it wasn't letting me leave. That night, I found a clearing with a fire pit, cold and unused, surrounded by totems made of bones and feathers tied with strips of bark. The stench of decay hung heavy. I backed away slowly, only to hear breathing behind me, deep, wet, labored. I spun around, flashlight shaking, but saw nothing. Then a shape emerged from the shadows, a tall figure, limbs bent unnaturally, skin mottled and pale. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the beam like cat's eyes. It moved with slow, jerky motions, and as it came closer, I saw its mouth stretched into a grim, toothless grin. I ran. I didn't look back. When dawn finally broke, I stumbled onto the dirt road again. My truck was gone. I had no choice but to walk. Days later, I made it back to civilization, thin, exhausted, and unable to explain what had happened. The authorities found no evidence of the cabin, no sign of the totems or the markings in the forest. Friends and family looked at me like I'd lost my mind. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the trees creak, I hear those footsteps circling outside, and I know the woods are still watching, still waiting. Story the end. The summer of 2016 was the first time I ever went to stay alone in the deep woods of northern Maine. I was fresh out of college, taking a gap year before grad school, and figured a few months as a caretaker for a remote hunting lodge would be the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. The lodge belonged to a man named Henry Whitcomb, who owned thousands of acres of forest, but rarely set foot on the property. He hired caretakers to check traps, maintain the trails, and keep an eye on things during hunting season. I thought it would be a quiet gig, just me, the wilderness, and the occasional hunter passing through. I drove the last 20 miles on a narrow dirt road that got worse with every mile. By the time I reached the parking clearing near the lodge, the trees were so thick and tall that the sky was just a sliver of gray. The lodge was a two-story cabin made of weathered logs with a stone chimney and a sagging porch. It looked like it had stood there for a century. I unpacked my gear, set up the generator, and settled in. My phone had zero signal, but Henry had left a satellite phone in case of emergencies. The first few days were peaceful. I checked the traps Henry had set out along the trails, cleaned the cabin, and spent evenings by the fireplace reading old hunting journals Henry had left behind. The forest was alive with birds, squirrels, and the occasional deer that came close enough to see but kept their distance. But there was something strange about the place. On my second night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a faint tapping on the window. I jumped up, heart racing, and shone my flashlight outside. Nothing. No animals. No people. Just the thick darkness and the shadows of pine trees swaying in the wind. I shrugged it off as a branch tapping against the glass. The next day, while walking the eastern trail, I noticed marks on the trees. Deep, jagged scratches that didn't look like animal claw marks. They were vertical, almost like someone had taken a large knife and slashed the bark. I took pictures and kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, I heard it again. The tapping. This time it was louder and seemed to come from all around the cabin. I stepped outside, flashlight scanning the tree line, but found nothing. No eyes reflecting, no movement, no sounds besides the wind. The nights grew worse. I started hearing footsteps circling the cabin, soft and slow, crunching leaves and twigs. I'd lie awake, gripping a hatchet I found in the shed, listening to the slow rhythm outside. The footsteps would stop, and sometimes I thought I heard whispering, but the wind muffled everything. One morning I found the porch littered with small bones, bird bones mostly, but arranged in a perfect circle. I have no idea how they got there. No footprints, no signs of animals dragging them in. Just the circle, pristine and deliberate. I called Henry on the satellite phone and told him about it. He sounded tired and warned me not to disturb whatever was out there. He told me stories of the locals who once called the woods home, of rituals and warnings passed down for generations, and to be careful at night. But I thought it was superstition. On the fifth night, the tapping turned into pounding. Heavy blows on the windows, the door, the walls. I hid under the blanket, barely breathing. The pounding stopped as suddenly as it started. Then a voice whispered my name from the woods. It was a woman's voice. Soft, sorrowful, echoing. I never replied. I stayed frozen until dawn. When morning came, I found strange footprints around the cabin, barefoot, large, and oddly shaped. They circled the building twice before disappearing into the woods. I packed my bag that day, ready to leave, but the road was blocked. A fallen tree lay across it, freshly uprooted and too large for me to move alone. My phone still had no signal. I was trapped. The following nights became worse. I saw shadows moving between the trees, too tall and thin to be animals. Sometimes just glimpses, a pale face staring from the darkness, eyes that gleamed with a terrible hunger. I started leaving offerings, small bits of food, trinkets from the cabin at the base of the biggest tree near the porch. The tree had strange carvings, spirals, and what looked like runes. On the last night, I was woken by a shrill scream, a sound that pierced the air and froze me in place. The door rattled violently, and the windows shook as if something was trying to get in. I grabbed the hatchet and stood by the door. The scream stopped abruptly. Silence. Then a slow, deliberate knock on the door. I didn't answer. The knocking turned into scratching, then the unmistakable sound of fingernails scraping wood. I stayed in the corner, shaking until dawn. When the sun finally rose, I found deep gouges on the door, like someone had tried to claw their way inside. I never went back to the lodge. A few months later, I heard that Henry had sent another caretaker who disappeared without a trace. Search parties found the lodge empty. No signs of struggle, but the strange symbols carved into every tree nearby. I still have the photos I took of those marks. Sometimes when the wind is right, I swear I hear that tapping on my windows. Story the end. The summer I turned 26, I decided to take a break from the city and spend a few weeks alone in the woods of northern Vermont. It wasn't a planned vacation, more like an escape. My job had been grinding me down for months, and I was desperate for quiet, for space where my thoughts wouldn't chase me in circles. I found a listing online for a small cabin deep in the Green Mountains. No phone service, no electricity, just a wood stove and a well. It sounded perfect. The drive up was long and winding, the roads narrowing until they were barely more than gravel paths between towering pines. I arrived just as the sun was sinking, painting the sky in bruised purple and orange. The cabin was older than I expected, rustic and weathered, with moss crawling up the sides and a crooked porch. The landlord had warned me the road was rough and to bring enough supplies. I unpacked quickly and settled in, lighting a fire in the stove, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to unwind. The first few days were peaceful. I hiked nearby trails, read books by the fire, and cooked simple meals on the propane stove. But on the third night, something changed. It began with the sounds. At first, I heard what I assumed were animals moving outside, a rustling, snapping of twigs. The forest was alive with night creatures, after all. But these sounds grew closer, more deliberate. There was a rhythm to them, like footsteps pacing back and forth just beyond the edge of the clearing. I peered out the window, but the darkness swallowed the trees. The moon was a thin sliver that night, barely casting shadows. Then came the tapping. Light, rhythmic taps on the cabin's wooden walls, like fingernails drumming a slow beat. I told myself it was a woodpecker or a branch knocking in the wind, but the pattern was too regular, too measured. I tried to shake it off, but sleep wouldn't come. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, just outside the door. "Come out!" I sat frozen, my heart pounding. The whisper came again, slightly louder. "Come out!" I didn't move. The cabin was small. I could see the door from where I sat. No shadows appeared, no movement. But the voice was there, unmistakable, human, yet impossible to place. It wasn't a scream or a shout, just a coaxing murmur that felt both urgent and cold. The next morning, I found scratch marks on the doorframe, long and deep. They hadn't been there before. Something had clawed at the wood, leaving ragged gouges. I started carrying a hunting knife with me inside the cabin after that. I thought maybe it was a bear or a large animal. But the signs didn't add up. No fur, no paw prints, just these deep scratches, and sometimes strange footprints outside. Long, narrow, almost human, but with too many toes or curved nails. The forest felt different after that night. Thicker, denser. The air itself seemed heavier, harder to breathe. One afternoon, I decided to hike down to a small river I'd seen on the map. It was about 2 miles away, through dense underbrush and steep hills. I took the trail slowly, keeping my eyes peeled for wildlife, but the woods were eerily silent. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was as if everything had stopped moving. Halfway there, I stumbled onto an old campsite. The fire pit was cold and filled with scattered ashes. Around it were dozens of small bones, bird bones, maybe some small mammals. But there was something else, too. A pile of roughly carved wooden figurines hanging from branches above the camp. Twisted humanoid shapes with exaggerated limbs and blank faces. Some were tied together with strips of leather or sinew. I felt a chill run down my spine and left quickly. Back at the cabin, I found fresh footprints in the mud around the porch, even though I hadn't heard anyone arrive. The prints led into the woods and vanished near a thicket of briars. That night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, almost frantic, like someone trying to break in. The whispering came again. "Come out, come play." I didn't sleep. The whispers felt like they were right outside the door, pressing in on me, promising safety and warmth, but I knew better. There was something wrong here, something ancient and angry. The next morning I packed up my things. I planned to leave as soon as the sun rose high enough to light the way. But just as I was locking the cabin door, I saw something or someone standing at the edge of the clearing. A figure cloaked in shadow, taller than any person, with long arms that almost touched the ground. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its eyes reflected the morning light, issued small glints of orange that felt alive. I froze. The figure didn't move but seemed to watch me, unmoving, silent. I hurried to my car and didn't look back. When I finally got cell signal, I called the local ranger station. I told them about the cabin, the footprints, the scratching, and the figure. The ranger hesitated, then told me the area was known for strange disappearances and unexplained sightings. Stories locals whispered about the hollow men who lurked in the deep woods, spirits or creatures that claimed the forest as their own. I never went back. Sometimes, months later, when I'm alone at night and the wind rattles my windows, I swear I hear tapping on my door, a soft, slow rhythm, and sometimes just barely a whisper, "Come out." Story, the end.